The letter sat unfinished on the plywood desk, ink drying in the desert heat. Lieutenant Colonel James McCree stared at the words he had written, then crossed them out, then written again. 34 years of service, and he still could not find the right way to say goodbye. Dear Bate, he had started 3 times. The mission is simple. We will be home for Christmas, I promise. But promises in war were like water in Anbar province, gone before you could cup your hands around them. McCree was 56 years old. His hands no longer shook when mortars hit close. His breath no longer caught when the radio crackled with casualty reports. These were not signs of courage. They were signs of time, of repetition, of seeing the same horror so many times it lost its edge. Like a knife drawn across a whetstone too often, eventually it just stopped cutting. He set down the pen and picked up the photograph instead. His wife smiled from behind the plastic sleeve, frozen in a moment from 2 deployments ago when his hair had been darker and her eyes less worried. Next to her, their son, David, 28 years old now, wearing the same uniform his grandfather had died in, the same one his father would soon take off forever. 72 hours, 3 days until retirement. McCree had counted it down like a prisoner marking time on cell walls, except prisoners did not have to write letters explaining why they might not make parole. Outside the plywood walls of his quarters, forward operating base Eagle breathed its evening rhythm. Generators hummed, boots scuffed gravel. Someone laughed, the sound sharp and brief, cut short like everything else out here. Iraq did not allow for long laughter. The desert swallowed joy too quickly. McCree opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a smaller photograph, edges worn soft from handling. Black and white. A young man in jungle fatigues, rifle slung across his chest, standing in mud that could have been anywhere but was specifically Southeast Asia. Specifically 1971. Specifically 3 months before a landmine turned First Lieutenant Robert McCree into a flag, and a telegram, and a hole in his son's childhood that 34 years of military service had never quite filled. He had been 11 when his father died, old enough to understand death but too young to understand purpose. His mother had given him the photograph at the funeral, pressed it into his palm like a secret, and whispered, "Your father died doing what mattered." McCree had spent the next 3 decades trying to decode what that meant. The answer, he suspected, was in the doing, not the dying. A knock rattled the door, sharp, military. McCree slid the photographs back into their places, the living with the living, the dead with the dead, and called out for whoever it was to enter. Captain Alina Voss stepped through, and the temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees. She had that effect, cold efficiency, every movement calculated, every word weighed. She was 34 years old and looked 40 from the weight of whatever she carried behind her eyes. McCree had served with a lot of officers who wore their stress outwardly. Voss wore hers like body armor, invisible until something struck it. "Sir," she said, and did not salute because they were indoors and technically off-duty, though McCree could not remember the last time anyone at Fob Eagle had been truly off anything. "The mission brief is ready. 1600 hours in the TOC." McCree nodded. He waited for her to leave. She did not. "Something else, Captain." Voss hesitated, and that hesitation told McCree more than any intelligence report. Captain Alina Voss did not hesitate. She executed. She confirmed. She moved forward with the momentum of someone who had decided that doubt was a luxury she could not afford. "Sir," she said finally, "this is your last mission. If you want to coordinate from the TOC, no one would question it. You have earned that right." McCree studied her face, searching for the trap. There was always a trap. "Are you questioning my fitness for command, Captain?" "No, sir, I am offering you a choice." The word hung between them. Choice. as if any of them had choices, as if the machine they served in allowed for personal preference. You did not choose missions, you received them, you executed them, you survived them or you did not. I appreciate the offer, McCree said, which was a polite way of saying he did not. I will be in the TOC at 1600. Voss nodded once crisp and turned to leave. She paused at the door. Sir, the intel on this one is solid, minimal risk, in and out. You will make your retirement ceremony. McCree watched her go and wondered why she felt the need to reassure him. In 20 months of serving alongside Captain Voss, he had never once heard her use the phrase minimal risk. She dealt in probabilities and contingencies, in backup plans and secondary objectives. Minimal risk was the kind of language politicians used, or people trying to convince themselves of something they did not quite believe. He looked back at the letter. Dear Bate, the mission is simple. He crumpled it and started again. The aid station smelled like disinfectant and sand. Everything in Iraq smelled like sand eventually. It worked its way into wounds, into lungs, into the creases of bandages no matter how carefully you sealed them. Sergeant First Class Sarah Keller had been fighting that sand for 7 months now, and the sand was winning. She sat on an overturned crate in the corner of the tent, inventory clipboard balanced on her knee, counting supplies she had already counted twice. Gauze, morphine, saline, tourniquets. The numbers never changed, but she counted anyway because counting was something you could control. Numbers did not bleed out. They did not scream. They stayed where you put them. 38 years old, 17 years of service. People assumed that meant she had seen everything. That time created immunity to the work. They were wrong. Time just taught you what to expect. It did not make the expecting any easier. Doc, you okay? She looked up. Private Tommy Reed stood in the entrance of the tent, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun, rifle slung across his narrow chest. 23 years old. Baby fat still softening his jawline despite 7 months of desert heat and MREs. He had that look young soldiers got when they were about to ask a question they thought might be stupid, but needed to ask anyway. Fine, Reed, what do you need? He stepped inside, letting the tent flap fall closed behind him. The light inside went amber, filtered through canvas that had seen too many deployments to ever be fully clean again. Tomorrow, he said, the mission, I was wondering. He trailed off, searching for words, found them, lost them again. Sarah set down the clipboard. She had learned that when soldiers struggled to speak, you gave them silence to fill. Pushing only made them retreat. What if I freeze, Reed said finally, out there? What if something happens and I just stop? Sarah had heard this question before. Every deployment, every new soldier. The fear was always the same even if the faces changed. They were not afraid of dying. That was abstract, cinematic, something that happened to other people in other units. They were afraid of failing, of being the one who broke when everyone else held together, of discovering in the worst possible moment that they were not who they thought they were. Then you unfreeze, she said. Fear is normal, quitting is not. Reed nodded, but his eyes said he did not quite believe her. Or maybe he believed her but did not believe in himself. There was a difference. Doc, can I ask you something else? She waited. Do you still get scared, like after all this time? Sarah reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out a small orange prescription bottle. She shook it once. The pills rattled like distant gunfire. Every night, she said, this is how I sleep, has been for 3 years. Reed stared at the bottle. Sarah waited for judgment. Instead, his shoulders dropped half an inch. Relief. The relief of knowing he was not alone in his fear. Does it help asking? Sometimes, Sarah said, depends on the question. Reed smiled, brief and uncertain. Thanks, Doc. He left. Sarah put the pill bottle back in her pocket and returned to her inventory. Gauze, morphine, saline, tourniquets. The numbers had not changed. They never did. Across the base, in a corner of the maintenance yard where broken equipment went to wait for parts that might never arrive, Staff Sergeant Marcus Sullivan sat cleaning his rifle for the fourth time that day. The weapon was already clean. He cleaned it anyway. 42 years old, 23 years of service, 12 of those years spent trying to forget 2 years he could not. His hands moved through the familiar ritual: disassemble, wipe, oil, reassemble. The motions were muscle memory now, required no thought, which was exactly why he did them. When his hands were busy, his mind could not wander. When his mind could not wander, it could not go back to that valley in 2004 where 12 men had walked in and only one had walked out. Ghost, someone had called him after. The ghost of Delta. The one who should have died but did not. Sullivan had tried to explain that surviving did not make you lucky. It made you a witness. Witnesses carried what they had seen until the weight of it broke them or they found a way to set it down. Sullivan had not yet figured out which one he was doing. Sergeant. He looked up. Sarah Keller stood 10 feet away, hands empty at her sides in that careful way medical personnel approached combat soldiers, like you might spook if she moved too fast. When did you last sleep? Sullivan considered lying, decided against it. Medical officers could smell lies the way dogs smelled fear. 2004, he said. Sarah took 3 steps closer, not close enough to crowd, close enough to matter. You. Last night, she said, with pharmaceutical assistance. She pulled the orange bottle from her pocket and set it on the hood of the nearby Humvee, offering evidence, offering equivalence. Sullivan set down his rifle. They stayed like that for a moment, 2 people who had learned that admitting weakness to the wrong person would end your career. Admitting it to the right person might save your life. Does it work? Sullivan asked. Enough, Sarah said, enough to function. He nodded. She picked up the pill bottle. Tomorrow, she said, you good to go. Sullivan looked at his rifle, thought about the mission brief he had read 3 times, looking for the thing that did not fit, the detail that meant trap. He had not found it yet, but his instincts screamed that it was there, hidden in the white space between words, in the pauses where intelligence officers chose their phrasing too carefully. I am good, he said, which was not the same as saying yes. Sarah studied his face. Whatever she saw there made her nod once slowly. If you need to talk, she said, before we go. I will not, Sullivan said, but I appreciate the offer. She left. Sullivan picked up his rifle and began the process again. Disassemble, wipe, oil, reassemble. Across the base, the call to evening chow echoed from loudspeakers mounted on poles, distorted by distance and dust. Sullivan did not move. He had stopped being hungry somewhere around 2005. Now he just ate when required, slept when possible, and waited for time to do whatever it was time did to men who had stayed too long in places they should have left. The Tactical Operations Center was crowded and hot. 30 bodies packed into a space designed for 20, all of them leaning over maps and monitors, tracking movements and probabilities, turning warfare into geometry. McCree stood at the front near the large screen display, watching his battalion leadership file in. Captains, lieutenants, senior NCOs, all of them wearing the same expression. Ready, tired, ready. Voss stood beside him, tablet in hand, waiting for silence. She did not have to wait long. When a mission brief began, soldiers stopped talking. They had learned that the difference between life and death often came down to a single detail you missed because you were whispering to the person next to you. Gentlemen, Voss began, then corrected herself with a glance toward the 3 female officers present. And ladies, Operation Phantom Sweep. Our objective is a confirmed insurgent safe house in eastern Ramadi. Intelligence indicates high-value target presence. We have a 72-hour window before the target relocates. She tapped her tablet. The screen behind her shifted to satellite imagery. A building, 2 stories, flat roof, surrounded by walls that had been white once before the war turned everything the color of old bone. The compound is here, Voss continued, 400 meters from the nearest coalition position. The approach is exposed, but intelligence suggests minimal security. Our assessment is that the insurgents believe themselves secure in this location. They are wrong. McCree watched the screen and listened to the tone of Voss's voice and felt something settle wrong in his gut. He had been doing this too long not to trust that feeling. It was not intuition. It was pattern recognition, the unconscious accumulation of 1,000 small details that did not add up. "Captain," he said, "define minimal security." Voss did not hesitate. Estimated 6 to 8 personnel, small arms, possibly 1 RPG position, standard defensive posture. And the source of this intelligence? Signals intercept, confirmed by human intelligence on the ground. How recent? 48 hours. McCree nodded slowly. 48 hours was an eternity in a combat zone. Positions changed. People moved. What was true on Monday could be catastrophically false by Wednesday. But intelligence officers hated uncertainty more than they hated risk, so they wrapped old information in confident language and called it current. "Captain, I want updated imagery. 12 hours old maximum, and I want secondary verification on that human source." Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, the window is time-sensitive. If we delay for additional confirmation, we risk losing the target entirely." "Then we risk it," McCree said. "I am not sending my people into a structure based on 2-day-old intelligence." The room had gone quiet, not the focused quiet of a brief, the uncomfortable quiet of junior officers watching senior officers disagree. McCree could feel them calculating. 72 hours until retirement. Why would he push back now? Why not just execute the mission and leave the hard questions for whoever came after? Because the people who came after did not write the letters to wives and mothers. The people who came after did not stand at memorial services reading names. McCree had written too many of those letters. He would write more if required, but he would not write them because he had failed to ask a simple question. Voss held his gaze for 3 seconds, then nodded. "I will request updated surveillance, sir. We brief again at 0600. McCree looked at the assembled officers. "Dismissed. Get some rest." They filed out, slow, reluctant. Rest was not something anyone did well the night before a mission. You lay in your rack staring at plywood ceilings, running through scenarios, checking gear you had already checked, writing mental letters to people you hoped you would see again. Voss remained after the others left. She stood very still, tablet against her chest like a shield. "Sir," she said quietly, "I understand your caution, but the intelligence is solid. I have verified it personally." McCree turned to face her fully. In the harsh fluorescent light of the TOC, she looked younger than 34, or maybe older. It was hard to tell with Voss. She carried herself like someone who had stopped counting birthdays and started counting missions. "Captain, in my experience, when an intelligence officer tells me something is solid, I check the foundation twice. No disrespect intended." "None taken, sir. But with respect, your experience is conventional warfare. This is a different kind of conflict. The rules are different." "The rules," McCree said, "are that soldiers follow orders and officers make sure those orders do not get soldiers killed unnecessarily. That rule has not changed since Valley Forge. Voss nodded, but her eyes said something else. Her eyes said you do not understand what is at stake here. Her eyes said there are things happening above your pay grade that require sacrifices you are not equipped to evaluate. McCree had seen that look before, on the faces of captains who thought they knew better than colonels, on the faces of intelligence officers who had access to classified information and mistook information for wisdom, on the faces of people who believed that certainty was the same thing as being right. 600 hours, he repeated, updated imagery, secondary confirmation, then we brief. Yes, sir, Voss said. She left. McCree stood alone in the TOC, staring at the satellite image on the screen. The building looked ordinary, exactly the kind of structure you would expect to house insurgents or civilians or nothing at all. War had a way of making everything look the same, dangerous, empty, indistinguishable. He thought about his father, wondered if Lieutenant Robert McCree had stood in a tent somewhere in the jungle, staring at maps, feeling this same unease, wondering if the mission was worth the risk, if the intelligence was good, if the people giving orders had thought it through, or if they were just moving pieces on a board, hoping the patterns made sense. His father had gone on the mission anyway, come home in a box, received a folded flag and a grateful nation's thanks. McCree walked out of the TOC into the cooling evening. 72 hours, 3 days. He just needed to make it 3 more days and he could hand this war to someone else. Let them stand in operations centers questioning intelligence. Let them write letters that started dear bait and ended with promises they might not keep. Across the base, soldiers prepared, checked weapons, wrote letters, prayed or did not pray, waited for morning. In the aid station, Sarah Keller sat on her crate and counted her supplies one more time. Gauze, morphine, saline, tourniquets. She added an extra box of bandages to her kit. Soldiers called it pessimism. Medics called it experience. In the maintenance yard, Marcus Sullivan finished cleaning his rifle for the 5th time. He sat in the dark, weapon across his lap, and thought about the 12 men who had trusted bad intelligence in 2004. Thought about how they had looked when he found them afterward. Thought about how he had lain beneath their bodies for 6 hours, pretending to be dead while the enemy celebrated, waiting for extraction that came too late to matter. He should have said something, should have gone to McCree directly, told him the mission felt wrong. But soldiers did not survive by questioning orders. They survived by following them. Sullivan had followed orders in 2004 and survived. His entire team had followed orders and died. He had never been able to reconcile which one of those outcomes was supposed to teach him the lesson. Tomorrow he would follow orders again, because that was what soldiers did, even the ones who knew better. In his quarters, Lieutenant David McCree lay in his rack, hands behind his head, staring at the plywood ceiling. 28 years old, 3rd deployment. He had volunteered his platoon for the lead position on tomorrow's mission, and his father had tried to talk him out of it. Not directly. Fathers who were also commanding officers could not be direct, but David had heard it in the pause before his father said approved, in the way his father's hand had lingered on his shoulder after the brief. David understood. His father was trying to protect him, but protection was not why David had joined. He had joined to prove something, to himself, to his father, to the ghost of the grandfather he had never met. He had joined because being the son of a career officer meant carrying expectations you had not asked for, and the only way to set them down was to earn the right to walk away from them. Tomorrow he would lead his platoon into that compound. They would clear it. They would secure the target or confirm its absence. They would return. And 3 days later his father would retire, and maybe then David could figure out who he was supposed to be when he was not standing in the shadow of 23 years of service and a grandfather who died before David was born. Outside his window, the desert sky turned from blue to purple to black. Stars appeared, the same stars that had appeared over this desert for thousands of years, indifferent to the people below who killed each other over ideas and boundaries and things that probably did not matter to anyone who had perspective enough to see the whole picture. But soldiers did not have that perspective. Soldiers had orders, missions, objectives. You did not think about whether the war made sense. You thought about whether the person next to you was going to make it home. Everything else was abstraction. David closed his eyes, tried to sleep, failed, got up, checked his gear, checked it again, wrote a letter to his mother that said, "I am fine and the mission is routine and I will call you when I can," all of which might be true, or might be the kind of lies that soldiers told because the truth was too heavy to put in an envelope. At 0200 hours, Sarah gave up on sleep and took a pill. At 0230, Sullivan finished cleaning his rifle for the 6th time. At 0300, McCree got out of bed and stood at his window, watching the perimeter lights of Fob Eagle push back against the darkness. 72 hours, he thought. Just 72 more hours. The darkness did not answer. At 0600, they gathered again in the TOC. Voss had the updated imagery. It showed the same building, the same walls, the same flat roof. Nothing had changed except the timestamp. McCree studied it, looking for the thing that did not fit, the detail that meant trap. He did not find it. That did not mean it was not there. Voss ran through the brief again. Approach, entry points, extraction, contingencies. Her voice was steady, professional. She had been doing this long enough to make warfare sound like logistics. Move this unit here. Place that asset there. Achieve this objective within this time frame. War as mathematics, except the numbers were people and the equations sometimes balanced and sometimes did not. Questions, Voss said. McCree looked at his officers. They looked back, silent, ready, waiting for him to say the thing that needed to be said. "This is my last mission," McCree said. "I want everyone to know that. 72 hours from now I will be on a plane home, but right now I am still your commander, and I will not let any of you take a risk I would not take myself. If anyone has doubts about this mission, speak now. No judgment, no consequences." Silence. "Then we execute at 0900, McCree said. "Dismissed." They filed out. David lingered near the door. Their eyes met. Father and son, colonel and lieutenant, two people who loved each other but could not say so because the uniform did not allow that kind of vulnerability. David nodded once. McCree returned it. Then David was gone, and McCree was alone with Voss. "The intelligence is solid," she said again, like she was trying to convince herself. "I hope you are right, Captain," McCree said. He left her standing there, tablet clutched to her chest, staring at the screen where a building waited in satellite silence, keeping whatever secrets it held. At 0900, the convoy rolled out, 4 Humvees, 32 soldiers. Sarah Keller sat in the third vehicle, medical pack between her knees, rifle across her lap. Next to her, Tommy Reed gripped his weapon too tightly. His knuckles were white. Sarah did not tell him to relax. Tension was fine. Tension kept you alert. It was the absence of tension you had to worry about. Soldiers who were too calm had either accepted death or stopped caring. Both were dangerous. Doc Reed said quietly, "You believe in ghosts." Sarah looked at him, 23 years old, his whole life ahead of him if the day went right, a folded flag and a telegram if it went wrong. "In war," she said, "we are all ghosts. Some of us just do not know it yet." Reed thought about that, nodded, did not ask what she meant. Maybe he already knew. The convoy drove through Ramadi, past buildings that had been homes once, past walls scarred with bullet holes, past children who watched them with eyes that had seen too much too young. The war had been here for years now. It had worn grooves into the city. Everyone knew their role. Soldiers drove through. Civilians watched. Insurgents waited. The pattern repeated until someone broke it. At 09:45 they reached the compound. David's platoon dismounted, formed up, prepared to enter. Sarah watched from the vehicle, rifle ready, eyes scanning roof lines and windows and the 100 places a person could hide with a weapon. The compound was quiet, too quiet. Marcus Sullivan stood beside her vehicle, weapon raised, covering the street. His eyes moved constantly, searching, always searching. "This does not feel right," he said quietly. Sarah had learned to trust that feeling, the one that lived in your spine, the one that screamed when everything looked fine but was not. "Colonel," she said into her radio, "recommend we hold position. Something is wrong here." McCree's voice came back, "Specify." Sarah looked at Sullivan. He looked at the compound, at the windows, at the walls. "No movement," Sullivan said. "No noise, no defensive posture. It is a trap." McCree was silent for 3 seconds. Then, "All units hold position. I want eyes on all approaches before we commit." But David was already moving. His platoon was already at the door, and sometimes momentum was stronger than caution. The door breached, the platoon entered. Sarah counted seconds. 1, 2, 3. At 4 seconds, the world ended. The explosion was not large. It did not need to be. It was precisely placed, surgical. The doorway collapsed inward, trapping 8 soldiers inside. The walls held, but the entrance became rubble. Then the second wave hit. RPGs from 3 directions. Small arms fire, coordinated, professional. They had walked into exactly what Sullivan had predicted, a trap, set with patience, sprung with precision. McCree's voice cut through the radio traffic. "All units return fire. Establish perimeter. Get me a head count." Sarah was already moving, grabbed her medical pack, jumped from the Humvee. McCree appeared, grabbed her arm. "That building could collapse. I cannot lose you too." Sarah looked at him, saw a father who had just watched his son disappear into a burning structure, saw a commander who knew he had made a mistake, saw a man who had 3 days until retirement and might not make it. "You are not losing anyone," she said. "That is a promise." She pulled free, ran toward the compound. Behind her, McCree's voice, "Keller, that is an order." Sarah did not look back. Orders were one thing. The oath she had taken was another. She had sworn to preserve life, not to preserve it conditionally, not to preserve it when it was convenient or safe or approved by the chain of command. She reached the collapsed entrance. Smoke poured from the gap. Inside, someone was screaming. Sarah Keller took a breath, checked her pack one last time. Gauze, morphine, saline, tourniquets. Then she crawled into the fire. Behind her, the battle raged. Ahead of her, 8 soldiers waited. One of them was David McCree. One of them was Tommy Reed. All of them were sons, brothers, fathers, husbands. All of them were hers to save or hers to lose. The numbers would not stay where she put them anymore. They were about to start moving, bleeding, dying. Sarah crawled forward into the smoke and dust and darkness, and somewhere behind her, Marcus Sullivan whispered a prayer he had not prayed since 2004. "Please," he said to whatever God listened to soldiers, "not again." The smoke swallowed Sarah Keller, and the last thing anyone saw was the red cross on her helmet, disappearing into the same building that had just tried to kill everyone inside it. 72 hours, McCree thought, crouched behind a Humvee, rifle raised, watching the building where his son had vanished. Just 72 more hours. The desert did not care about his timeline. The enemy did not care about his retirement. The war had its own schedule, and it had just decided that today was the day James McCree would learn what his father had learned in a jungle 40 years ago. That some promises cannot be kept, that some missions do not have happy endings, that sometimes you do everything right and people still die. The firing continued. The smoke rose, and inside the collapsed building, Sarah Keller moved through the darkness with nothing but a headlamp and a promise she might not be able to keep. Outside, the sun climbed higher, the temperature rose, the battle found its rhythm. And in a tactical operations center 4 miles away, Captain Alina Voss stared at a monitor showing drone footage of the ambush, and slowly, carefully, reached for a phone that connected to a number that did not officially exist. The voice on the other end said one word. "Report." Voss closed her eyes. "It is done," she said. Then she hung up, sat very still, and wondered if 32 lives were enough to buy whatever her superiors thought they were purchasing. The answer, she suspected, would not arrive until long after it was too late to matter. Darkness had texture in the collapsed building. It was not the simple absence of light but something denser, thicker, made of smoke and pulverized concrete, and the particular quality of air that has been shocked by explosion. Sarah Keller crawled through it with her headlamp cutting a narrow beam that showed her 3 feet at a time. 3 feet of rubble, 3 feet of twisted rebar, 3 feet closer to the screaming. Her medical pack scraped against broken concrete as she squeezed through a gap between a fallen beam and what used to be a wall. The space was barely wide enough for her shoulders. She exhaled completely, made herself smaller, pulled herself through with her forearms. Behind her, daylight was a memory. Ahead, the screaming had words now. "Help God, please." Sarah recognized the voice. Private First Class Jensen, 20 years old, married, new father. She had seen the photos he carried. A little girl named Emma, 2 years old, blonde curls, gap-toothed smile. She crawled faster. The headlamp beam found him in a corner where the ceiling had buckled but not completely collapsed. He was on his back, hands pressed against his abdomen, blood welling up between his fingers in rhythmic pulses that matched his heartbeat. Arterial. Sarah's brain cataloged the injury in the half-second it took her to reach him. Abdominal trauma, likely liver or spleen, maybe both. Minutes to live without intervention, maybe less. "Jensen," she said. Her voice was calm, clinical. The voice she had practiced for 17 years until it became automatic. The voice that said, "I am in control," even when control was an illusion. "Look at me." His eyes found hers, wide, terrified, already seeing the darkness that waited past the pain. "What is your daughter's name?" Sarah said. Not a question, a command, an anchor. "Emma," Jensen whispered. 2 years old. I have not." She stopped breathing. "I have not seen her yet, got the photos, have not held her." "You will," Sarah lied. She was very good at lying when lives depended on it. "You are going to hold her. But right now I need you to look at me and breathe." Her hands were already moving, found the source of the bleeding, applied pressure. Jensen screamed. The sound bounced off concrete and came back multiplied. Sarah did not flinch. Pain meant alive. Silence meant gone. "Doc," a voice called from somewhere in the darkness. Lieutenant David McCree. His voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the tremor underneath. The voice of someone holding themselves together by force of will. "We need to get out. Building is unstable." "He is unstable," Sarah called back without looking up. "Building can wait." "Doc, we do not have time." "Then I better work faster." She had Jensen's vest open now, his uniform cut away. The wound was worse than she hoped, better than she feared. The blade edge between savable and lost. She had walked that edge so many times she knew its geography. knew exactly how much pressure, how much morphine, how fast she could work before shock set in and his body decided dying was easier than fighting. Her hands shook. They always shook. 17 years and they still shook every single time because hands remembered what minds tried to forget. Hands remembered all the times pressure had not been enough. All the times morphine had only made the dying easier instead of preventing it. All the wounds that looked survivable right up until they were not. Doc Tommy Reed appeared beside her. His face was gray with concrete dust. "You are shaking." Sarah clamped the artery, tied it off with practice speed. "Always do," she said. "Has not stopped me yet." The ceiling groaned. Dust rained down. Somewhere above them, the structure was deciding whether to stand or fall. Sarah could feel it in her chest. The wrongness of being inside something that wanted to become rubble. She worked faster, packed the wound, pressured dressing. Her last roll of Israeli bandage went around Jensen's abdomen, pulled tight, secured. His breathing steadied. The bleeding slowed, not stopped, just slowed, but slow was better than fast. Slow meant minutes, fast meant seconds. "Jensen, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open. "Yeah." "You are going to be okay. I need you to believe that." He tried to smile, failed. "Okay." David appeared over her shoulder. His face was soot-blackened. Blood ran from a cut above his eye. He looked younger than 28. Looked like every lieutenant Sarah had ever seen in their first real firefight. The moment when war stopped being an abstract concept and became something that tried to kill you personally. "What else?" David said. "2 broken legs, concussion, shrapnel wounds, 3 walking wounded. We need to move them." Sarah looked at the gap she had crawled through, looked at Jensen, looked at the soldiers with broken legs. The math was simple and cruel. Some of them would not fit through that gap. Some of them would die screaming if she tried to move them. "We need another way out," she said. "There is no other way. Front entrance is collapsed. Back wall is blocked by the second explosion." "Then we make a way." "How?" Sarah looked at David, saw his father's eyes, saw the weight of command settling on shoulders too young to carry it easily, saw a lieutenant trying to save his men and learning that sometimes trying was not enough. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "I need you to lead, not carry patients, not make medical decisions. Lead. Can you do that?" David stared at her. For a moment she thought he would argue. Then something shifted behind his eyes. The boy stepped back. The officer stepped forward. "Sullivan," David called into his radio, "I need an extraction point. North wall. Can you make it happen?" Outside the building, Marcus Sullivan stood with his rifle raised, firing controlled bursts at muzzle flashes in distant windows. The radio crackled against his ear. David's voice. Calm now. Focused. Sullivan had heard that tone before. In 2004. In the voices of men who had just realized they were going to die but refused to do it quietly. He recognized it the way you recognize a song you have not heard in years but still know every word. "Give me 2 minutes," Sullivan said. He ran to the nearest Humvee, grabbed the breaching charges they carried for locked doors, C4-shaped charges, enough explosive to make a hole in concrete or turn a person into mist if you were standing too close. He sprinted to the north wall of the compound. Bullets snapped past his head. He ignored them. After 2004, after lying in a pile of dead friends for 6 hours pretending to be a corpse, bullets seemed less important. You could see bullets coming. It was the things you could not see that killed you. He placed the charges, set the timer, 90 seconds, ran. The explosion peeled back a section of wall like opening a can. Concrete and rebar bent outward. Smoke poured through. Inside, Sarah heard it, felt it, grabbed Jensen under his arms. "That is our exit," she said. "Move." David organized them into a chain. Walking wounded helped carry the immobile. Those who could stand helped those who could not. It was ugly, inefficient, exactly the kind of evacuation that training manuals said would fail. But training manuals were written by people who had never tried to save 8 soldiers in a collapsing building while the enemy fired on your position. Sarah dragged Jensen toward the hole in the wall. His blood left a trail on broken concrete. He was unconscious now. Better. Consciousness meant feeling pain. Unconsciousness meant the body had decided to conserve energy for staying alive instead of processing suffering. She reached the hole. Hands grabbed Jensen from outside. Sullivan, 2 other rangers. They pulled him through into daylight. Sarah turned back. Reed, move. Tommy Reed was helping a soldier with a broken leg, Specialist Hayes. The leg was compound fracture, bone visible through torn fabric and skin. Hayes could not put weight on it, could barely breathe through the pain. Tommy got Hayes to the hole, handed him through, turned back for the last soldier. The ceiling groaned again, louder this time. Sarah looked up, saw a crack spreading across concrete, saw dust falling in sheets, saw the future arriving in slow motion. Reed, she yelled, out now. One more, Tommy called back, just one more. There was always one more. You could always justify one more trip, one more patient, one more minute, right up until the building fell and one more became none. Sarah ran back into the smoke, found Tommy trying to lift Corporal Martinez. Martinez was conscious, aware. His eyes met Sarah's and she saw that he knew, saw that he had already done the math. His injuries were severe but not immediately fatal, but moving him would take time they did not have. Leave me, Martinez said. His voice was steady, resigned, the voice of someone who had already made peace with what was coming. Get out. Nobody gets left, Sarah said. She grabbed his other arm. Tommy took his legs. They lifted together. The ceiling cracked. The sound was enormous, final, the sound of structure giving up. Move, Sarah shouted. They ran, stumbled, dragged Martinez between them. The hole in the wall was 20 feet away, then 10, then 5. The beam fell. Sarah saw it in her peripheral vision, a massive piece of concrete and rebar dropping like judgment. She shoved Tommy forward, hard. He stumbled through the hole, Martinez with him. The beam hit. Pain exploded through Sarah's left leg. White hot, comprehensive, she fell. The beam was across her shin, pinning her. She tried to pull free, could not. The weight was impossible. Outside she heard shouting, heard Tommy screaming her name. Then Tommy was there, back inside, coming for her. No, Sarah tried to say, but her voice would not work. The pain had stolen it. Tommy grabbed the beam, tried to lift it, could not. It was too heavy, he strained. Tendons stood out in his neck. Face went red, the beam did not move. Sarah grabbed his arm, shook her head, pointed at the exit. Tommy looked at her, 23 years old, barely out of training, still believed the world made sense, still believed courage was enough. Doc, he said, I cannot. You have to, Sarah managed. Get out. Not without you. The ceiling cracked again, wider, deeper. Secondary collapse was coming. Sarah could feel it in the way the air pressure changed, in the way dust fell in different patterns. The building was past the point of saving. It was deciding how to fall, how many people to take with it. Tommy, Sarah said, listen to me. Your mother, tell her I said you were not scared. Lie if you have to. Tommy shook his head. Tears cut tracks through the dust on his face. He grabbed the beam again, pulled, screamed with effort. The beam shifted, half an inch, enough. Sarah pulled her leg free. Agony, white stars across her vision, she crawled. Tommy grabbed her, dragged her. They were 3 feet from the hole when the ceiling fell. Sarah saw Tommy's face, saw his eyes go wide, saw understanding arrive, saw him push her. She fell through the hole into daylight. Behind her, the building collapsed. The sound was apocalyptic, metal screaming, concrete pulverizing, the wet crunch of a structure eating itself. Sarah hit the ground outside and rolled, looked back. The hole was gone, filled with rubble, sealed. Tommy was on the other side. Sarah screamed, tried to stand. Her leg would not hold her. Sullivan appeared, grabbed her, held her back. No, Sarah fought him. No, he is in there, Tommy is. I know, Sullivan said. His voice was gentle, terrible. The voice of someone who had been here before, who knew what came next, I know. Sarah screamed again. Not words, just sound, pure grief-given voice. The rubble settled. Dust rose in a cloud. Somewhere inside that collapsed structure Tommy Reed was buried, 23 years old, would never see 24, would never hold his own daughter, would never grow old, would never do any of the things people did when they survived wars. Sarah stared at the rubble. Her hands were still shaking, still covered in Jensen's blood, still trying to save a life that was already gone. Sullivan pulled her back behind cover as enemy fire intensified. The insurgents had seen the collapse, knew the Americans were vulnerable, were pressing the attack. McCree appeared, crouched beside Sarah, looked at the collapsed building, at the dust still rising. His face was stone. He had trained himself not to show emotion in combat, but Sarah saw it anyway, in the way his jaw clenched, in the way his hand trembled when he keyed his radio. All units, McCree said. Casualty report now. The responses came in. Clipped, professional, 8 rescued, 1 KIA, Tommy Reed. David's voice broke on the radio. Dad, Tommy, he. I know, McCree said. His voice was iron. We grieve later, fight now. But Sarah saw his hand, saw it curl into a fist, saw him close his eyes for exactly 1 second, a lifetime of grief compressed into a single breath. Then his eyes opened and he was a colonel again. Commander, leader, the man who had to make sure 7 people did not die trying to avenge 1. Sullivan moved Sarah behind the Humvee. Her leg was wrong, broken or badly damaged. She could not tell. Pain was information, and right now the information was overwhelming. She reached into her medical pack with trembling fingers, found morphine, hesitated. She needed to be sharp, clear. There were still wounded who needed her. Jensen was critical. Hayes needed that leg stabilized. Martinez needed observation. She could not afford to be dulled by drugs. But the pain was too much. It was eating her ability to think. Sarah injected half a dose. Compromise, enough to function, not enough to float away. The morphine hit. The pain receded. Not gone, just distant, happening to someone else. She looked at the collapsed building, at the rubble that contained Tommy Reed's body. Sullivan, she said. Her voice was flat, empty. I should have pulled him out first. Sullivan shook his head. You did not kill him. The building did. The people who set the trap did. You tried to save him. Trying is not enough. It is all we have. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to scream that trying should count for something, that effort should matter, that all the years of training and all the lives saved should add up to enough credit that the universe would give you one, just Tommy. But the universe did not do accounting. It did not care about fairness or effort or how much you deserved a win. It just moved forward, indifferent, relentless. Jensen, Sarah said. Where is Jensen? Sullivan pointed, 20 yards away. Medics had him on a stretcher, IV line in his arm, chest rising and falling, alive. Sarah had saved him, lost Tommy saving him. The math was brutal, 1 for 1. even trade, except Emma Jensen would grow up with a father and Tommy's mother would bury a son, and Sarah would carry the weight of that choice for however long she lived. Which was the job? Which was what she had signed up for? Save who you can, lose who you must, never stop trying. The firing continued. McCree coordinated the defense. David rallied his remaining platoon. Sullivan provided covering fire. The Rangers held their ground because that was what Rangers did. They held. Sarah sat with her back against the Humvee and stared at her hands. They were still shaking. 17 years and they still shook. Because hands remembered. Because hands could not lie to themselves the way minds could. Her hands remembered all the Tommies, all the young soldiers who died while she tried to save them, all the promises she made that the universe refused to honor. She closed her eyes, saw Tommy's face, saw him pushing her toward the exit, saw him choosing. In that moment, he had been the medic and she had been the patient. He had made the same calculation she made every day. Save the one who can save others. It did not make it hurt less. Sullivan appeared beside her again, held out a canteen. Sarah took it, drank. The water was warm, tasted like dust and plastic. She drank anyway. "Doc," Sullivan said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Sarah looked at him, 42 years old, eyes like graves. Whatever he was about to say, it was going to hurt. 2004, Sullivan said. Delta mission. Bad intel. 12 men died. I survived. I know, Sarah said. I read your file. Then you know I have been carrying them for 2 years. 12 ghosts. Every night. Every mission. Sarah waited. Today you saved 7, Sullivan said. Lost 1. I know the math feels wrong, feels like failure, but Doc, 7 families get their soldiers back. 7 men get to go home because of you. One does not, Sarah said. One never does. There is always one. We do not get to save everyone. Tommy saved me, Sarah said. He pushed me, he chose. Then honor that choice. Do not waste it on guilt. Sarah looked at the collapsed building, at the dust still settling, at the rubble that would eventually be cleared and sorted and searched, at the place where a 23-year-old private had made a decision that cost him everything and saved her life. She touched her medical pack, felt the weight of the supplies inside: gauze, morphine, saline, tourniquets, the tools of her trade, the instruments of temporary mercy in a world that offered none permanently. Her radio crackled, McCree's voice. Keller, sitrep. Sarah keyed the radio. Her voice came out steady, professional, the voice she had practiced until it became reflex. 7 rescued, stable for transport, 1 KIA, Reed. Saying his name made it real, made it final. Tommy Reed was not missing, not wounded, not trapped. He was killed in action. He was a statistic, a line in a report, a flag and a telegram and a hole in his mother's life that would never be filled. Copy, McCree said. Medevac inbound, ETA 10 minutes. Roger. Sarah looked at Jensen on his stretcher, at Hayes with his broken leg, at Martinez and the others, all of them alive because she had crawled into a collapsing building and refused to leave without them. All of them alive because Tommy had crawled back in and refused to leave without her. The math would never balance. 7 lives for 1. It should feel like winning. It felt like drowning. Sullivan helped her stand. Her leg screamed. She ignored it. There was work to do. Jensen needed monitoring. Hayes needed pain management. The others needed assessment. She was the medic. This was her job. She limped to Jensen, checked his vitals. Pulse was weak but present, breathing shallow but steady. The dressing was holding. He would make it to the field hospital, would probably survive, would go home to Emma, would hold his daughter. Would live the life Tommy would not. Sarah moved to the next patient, and the next, working through them methodically, clinically. Her hands still shook, but they knew what to do. 17 years of muscle memory. 17 years of save who you can. The medevac helicopters arrived. Blackhawks. The sound of their rotors was salvation and judgment. They would take the wounded away, would take Jensen to surgeons who could finish what Sarah had started, would take the others to safety, would leave Sarah here with the dust and the rubble and the memory of Tommy's face in the moment before the ceiling fell. The loadmaster helped her get Jensen aboard, then Hayes, then the others, one by one, living cargo, precious, fragile. Sarah stood back and watched them lift off, watched the helicopters rise into the Iraqi sky, watched them disappear into the distance. David appeared beside her. His face was gray, exhausted. He had just led his first combat mission, had just lost his first soldier. Sarah knew what that did to an officer, knew the weight that settled on your shoulders when someone died under your command. Doc, David said. Tommy, he saved my life, Sarah said. He came back for me, he chose. David nodded, did not speak. What was there to say? War took. That was its nature. It took young men who were brave and foolish and good. It took them and gave back bodies and flags and grief that never fully healed. Lieutenant McCree, Sarah said, you did well today. Your father would be proud. David looked at her, 28 years old, eyes older now than they had been this morning. War did that, aged you in hours instead of years. I led them into a trap, David said. You led them out of one, Sarah corrected. 7 men are alive because you kept your head, because you organized the evacuation, because you did your job. One is not. One never is, Sarah said. We do not get to save everyone, we just have to try. McCree Sr. approached, looked at his son, at Sarah, at the collapsed building. Report, he said to David. David straightened, became an officer again. 7 rescued, extensive injuries but all stable. 1 KIA, Private First Class Tommy Reed. He died covering the evacuation. McCree absorbed this. His face showed nothing, but Sarah saw his hand curl into a fist again, saw him force it to relax. Reed will be recommended for Bronze Star, McCree said, posthumous, for valor. David nodded. The battle had moved on. The insurgents had withdrawn. The compound was quiet now except for the settling sounds of rubble and the distant crack of sporadic gunfire from other sectors of Ramadi. Sarah sat on the running board of a Humvee and stared at her hands. They had stopped shaking. The morphine had done that. Or maybe shock. Or maybe she had finally run out of adrenaline after 17 years of combat medicine. Sullivan sat beside her, did not speak, just sat. 2 people who understood that sometimes silence was better than words. After a long time, Sarah spoke. Do you think about them, the 12? Every day, Sullivan said. Does it get easier? No, but you learn to carry it different, like a scar instead of a wound. Sarah touched her leg where the beam had pinned her. It would scar, would remind her every day of the moment Tommy pushed her to safety, would be a permanent marker of the choice he made. Some scars were earned, some were given. All of them told stories you could not forget even if you wanted to. The sun was lower now. The desert heat was fading into evening cool. In a few hours it would be dark. The night would bring its own problems, its own fears, but for now there was this moment, this quiet, this chance to breathe. Sarah's radio crackled, Voss's voice, cold, professional. All units, stand by for intelligence update. Sarah and Sullivan exchanged a look. Intelligence update, after the mission, after the ambush, after Tommy died. Sullivan's jaw tightened. "Something is wrong," he said quietly. Sarah keyed her radio. "This is Keller. What update?" Voss hesitated, just long enough to be noticed. "Return to FOB. Full debrief at 1800 hours." The line went dead. Sarah looked at Sullivan. He looked back. Both of them had survived long enough to recognize the feeling, the instinct, the thing that lived in your spine and screamed when patterns did not match. "The intelligence was bad," Sullivan said. "We walked into a prepared ambush, professional, coordinated. They knew we were coming." Sarah thought about the timing, the placement, the way the first explosion had been calibrated to trap instead of kill, the way the second wave had come from exactly the right positions to pin them down. "Someone told them," she said. Sullivan nodded slowly. "In 2004, my team walked into an ambush. We had been told the intel was solid, minimal resistance, in and out." "What happened?" "We died, all of us, except me, and the intel had come from the same source that sent us there." "Who?" Sullivan looked toward the TOC 4 miles away, where Voss sat with her monitors and her tablets and her encrypted phone calls. "Captain Alina Voss was my operations officer," Sullivan said, "in 2004. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. The pieces were moving, connecting, forming a picture she did not want to see. "You think she knew," Sarah said. "You think she sent us into this knowing it was a trap?" "I think," Sullivan said carefully, "that Captain Voss has access to intelligence above our clearance level. And I think sometimes people with access to that intelligence make decisions that cost soldiers' lives. And I think they justify those decisions with math we are not allowed to see." Sarah thought about Tommy, about Jensen, about the 7 who lived and the 1 who died, about the trolley problem playing out in real time with real blood. "If she knew," Sarah said, "if she sent us in knowing." "Then we need proof," Sullivan finished. "Because accusing a superior officer of deliberately sacrificing soldiers is treason unless you can prove it. And proof is hard to find when the people covering up the crime are the same people who classify what counts as evidence." Sarah stood, her leg protested, she ignored it, walked to the collapsed building, stared at the rubble. Somewhere under there, Tommy Reed's body was cooling. Somewhere in North Carolina, his mother was living the last hours of her life before she received the news that would break her. Somewhere, the people who had set this trap were congratulating themselves on a successful operation. And somewhere, Sarah thought, there has to be evidence. There has to be something that proves this was not bad luck. That proves someone chose this. That proves Tommy did not die for nothing. She turned back to Sullivan. "We find it," she said, "whatever it takes. We find the proof." Sullivan nodded. "But Doc, if we do this, if we go after Voss and whoever is above her, they will come for us. They will destroy our careers, might destroy more than that." Sarah looked at her hands, still stained with Jensen's blood, with Tommy's, with all the blood from all the soldiers she had tried to save over 17 years. "I do not care about my career," she said. "I care about making sure the next Tommy does not die because someone decided his life was acceptable math." "Then we start tonight," Sullivan said, "at the debrief. We watch, we listen, and we find the crack in the lie." The convoy rolled back toward Fob Eagle as the sun touched the horizon. Sarah sat in the back of the Humvee, rifle across her lap, leg throbbing despite the morphine. She stared out at the desert, at the endless sand, at the place where the sky met the earth in a line so straight it looked drawn by a ruler. Somewhere out there, insurgents were celebrating. Somewhere, people were making plans for the next ambush, the next trap, the next group of soldiers who would walk into death because they trusted the intelligence they were given. And somewhere, in a TOC with air conditioning and satellite uplinks and all the comforts of modern warfare, Captain Alina Voss was preparing her report, sanitizing the language, turning catastrophe into acceptable losses, turning Tommy Reed into a line item. Sarah touched her medical pack, felt the weight of it, the responsibility. She had saved 7, lost 1. The math should feel like winning. It felt like war, which was the only truth that mattered. The sun set, the desert went dark, and Sarah Keller rode back to base carrying one more ghost than she had left with that morning. Tommy Reed, 23 years old, who had believed courage was enough, who had been right and wrong in equal measure, who would never know that the choice he made in a collapsing building would be the thing that finally broke the silence around what had been done to him and 12 Delta operators, and however many others had died because someone decided their lives were acceptable collateral. Sarah would make sure he knew, even if he was not alive to hear it, even if it cost her everything. She would make sure he knew his death meant something. The convoy reached Fob Eagle. The gate opened. They drove through into the illusion of safety. And somewhere in the TOC, a phone rang with a number that did not officially exist, and Captain Alina Voss answered it with her hand shaking just enough to prove she was still human under all the math. The debrief room was too cold. Someone had set the air conditioning to Arctic, probably thinking it would keep people alert. Instead, it made everything feel clinical, sterile, the kind of cold that lived in morgues and places where bad news was delivered with PowerPoint presentations. Sarah sat in the back row, leg elevated on a chair someone had brought her. The field medic had splinted it. Possible fracture. Definitely damaged. She would need X-rays when they got back to a proper facility. For now, she had more morphine in her system and a growing certainty that the pain in her leg was the least important thing wrong with this day. Around her, the other survivors filled the plastic chairs. David sat 3 rows up, spine rigid, staring at nothing. Sullivan was near the door, positioned so he could see everyone who entered. Old habits from Delta. Always know your exits. Always watch the room. McCree stood at the front beside a laptop connected to a projector. His uniform was still dusty from the firefight. He had not changed, had not cleaned up. Sarah recognized the choice. When your soldiers were bleeding, you did not take time to look presentable. You wore the dirt. You earned it. Captain Alina Voss entered carrying a tablet and a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. She looked fresh. Clean uniform, hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had not seen combat dust. She had been in the TOC during the ambush, safe behind concrete and sandbags while soldiers died 4 miles away. Sarah watched her carefully, looking for tells, for the crack in the professional facade, for anything that suggested guilt or knowledge or the weight of decisions that cost lives. Voss set her materials on the table at the front of the room and waited for everyone to settle. The room went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of people at ease, the tense quiet of soldiers waiting to hear how their friends had died and whether anyone was going to take responsibility. "Gentlemen," Voss began, then caught herself. "And Sergeant Keller. First, let me say that today's operation encountered unexpected resistance. The intelligence we received indicated minimal hostile presence. That intelligence was clearly incomplete." Incomplete, Sarah thought. Not wrong, not falsified. Incomplete. The language of someone covering their ass. "Our casualty count stands at 1 killed in action. Private First Class Tommy Reed." Voss paused, as if the pause made the loss more meaningful. As if silence could honor the dead when it was silence that had gotten them killed in the first place. "Reed died performing his duty," Voss continued. "He will be recommended for Bronze Star with Valor device. His sacrifice saved the lives of 7 soldiers, including Sergeant Keller. Sarah felt everyone's eyes turn to her. She kept her gaze on Voss, did not acknowledge the attention. Tommy's death was not about her, was not about valor or sacrifice or any of the words people used to make killing sound noble. Tommy died because someone sent them into a trap. Everything else was decoration. Additionally, Voss said, "We successfully extracted 7 wounded personnel. All are stable and expected to survive." From a tactical standpoint, despite the unexpected resistance, the mission achieved its secondary objective of denying the enemy use of that structure. Sarah's hands clenched. Secondary objective. They had not even mentioned a secondary objective in the initial brief. Now Voss was retconning the mission, turning catastrophe into acceptable outcome. A building was destroyed. Tommy was dead, but at least they had denied the enemy use of a structure that probably had not been strategically important in the first place. Sullivan raised his hand. His voice was calm, flat, the voice of someone asking a question they already knew the answer to. "Captain, what was the source of the intelligence that indicated minimal resistance?" Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The intelligence came from multiple sources. Signals intercept. Human intelligence. Standard verification protocols were followed. "Who verified it?" "I did," Voss said, "personally." "And the signals intercept. When was it recorded?" Voss paused. Sarah saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. How much to admit? How much to obscure? How to maintain the lie without making it obvious? 48 hours prior to mission execution, Voss said finally. Sullivan nodded slowly. So the intelligence was 2 days old, and in those 48 hours the enemy could have reinforced the position, changed their disposition, prepared an ambush. The intelligence was current at the time it was gathered, Voss said. Her voice had gone colder. Situations evolve. That is the nature of combat. Did the situation evolve? Sullivan asked. Or did someone inform the enemy we were coming? The room went silent. The kind of silence that follows an accusation. The kind where everyone holds their breath waiting to see if violence or truth arrives first. Voss stared at Sullivan. Her face was stone. "Sergeant, are you suggesting there was a breach of operational security?" "I am suggesting," Sullivan said carefully, "that a coordinated ambush of that precision required advanced knowledge. The enemy knew our approach route, knew our entry point, had charges placed in exactly the right locations to trap personnel inside the structure. That level of preparation takes time and information." Voss set down her tablet. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of rank and authority and the implicit threat that came with both. "Sergeant Sullivan, I understand you have personal history with classified operations that ended badly, but I will not tolerate conspiracy theories in my briefings. The enemy in Ramadi is sophisticated. They do not need advance warning to set traps. They need patience and experience, both of which they have." Sullivan held her gaze. "Yes, ma'am, I am sure you are right." But his tone said the opposite. Said, "I know what you did." Said, "I was there in 2004 when you got 12 men killed and walked away clean." Sarah watched the exchange and understood what Sullivan was doing. He was probing, testing, seeing how Voss reacted under pressure, looking for the crack. McCree stepped forward. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Captain Voss, I want a full review of the intelligence chain. Who gathered it? Who analyzed it? Who verified it? Every step documented. On my desk by 0800 tomorrow." Voss turned to face him. "Sir, with respect, the intelligence protocols are classified above your clearance level." "Then get me clearance," McCree said. or get me someone who has it, because I just lost a soldier on a mission based on intelligence you personally verified. And I want to know why that intelligence failed to predict a coordinated ambush. The air in the room had changed. This was no longer a debrief. It was a confrontation, colonel versus captain, experience versus ambition, the old guard questioning the new methods. Voss straightened her shoulders. I will submit a request for declassification review. But sir, I must remind you that you have 72 hours until retirement. This matter will likely take longer than that to resolve. McCree smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Then I guess I better work fast. He dismissed the room. People filed out slowly, reluctant, sensing that something important had just happened but not quite sure what. Sarah waited until most of them were gone before standing. Her legs screamed. She welcomed the pain. Pain meant focus, meant clarity. Sullivan appeared beside her, helped her toward the door without being asked. They passed Voss on the way out. She was gathering her materials. Her hands were steady, but Sarah noticed the tablet screen, noticed the email notification that had appeared, noticed Voss delete it without reading. Someone was watching, someone was listening, someone wanted to know what had been said in this room. Outside, the night air was cooler than the debrief room, but barely. Iraq in December was still warmer than North Carolina in July. Sarah limped toward the aid station. Sullivan walked beside her. Neither spoke until they were well away from the TOC. She is dirty, Sullivan said quietly. Maybe, Sarah said, but dirty how? Is she taking bribes? Is she incompetent? Or is she following orders from someone above her who decided 32 lives were acceptable losses for something we are not cleared to know about? Sullivan considered this. In 2004, I thought she was just ambitious, thought she had pushed for a mission to make herself look good, ignored warning signs because success would mean promotion. And now I think she is not the top of the chain. She is a link. Someone is giving her orders, someone with enough power to classify evidence, to bury inquiries, to make soldiers disappear into acceptable math. Sarah thought about Tommy, about the way Voss had said his name, with appropriate solemnity but no actual grief, like reading from a script, like she had done this before. We need proof, Sarah said, something that cannot be classified, cannot be buried. Sullivan nodded toward the maintenance yard. Tommy's gear is still there. His helmet, his rifle, everything he was carrying. Sarah understood immediately. His helmet cam, the footage. If he was recording, Sullivan said, we might have video of the explosion, of the placement, of the timing, enough to prove it was a planned ambush and not just bad luck. They changed direction, headed toward the yard where personal effects from casualties were stored pending transport home. It was late, nearly midnight. The yard was empty except for a single private pulling guard duty. Sarah recognized him, Specialist Marcus Webb, 20 years old. She had treated him for heat exhaustion 2 months ago, had made sure he got IV fluids and rest instead of being sent back to duty too soon. Webb saw her limping, stood straighter. Ma'am, you okay? Been better, Sarah said. We need to check Reed's gear. Make sure everything is accounted for before it ships home. Webb hesitated. Ma'am, I am supposed to wait for authorization from the TOC before releasing any KIA personal effects. I know the protocol, Specialist, Sarah said gently, but Reed was my responsibility. I need to make sure his mother gets everything that belonged to him. Can you understand that? Webb looked at her leg, at the splint, at the blood still on her uniform, at Sullivan standing silent and solid beside her. He was 20 years old and had been in country for 4 months. He had not yet learned to question authority when it came with sergeant stripes and the smell of recent combat. "Yes, ma'am," Webb said. "Let me get the inventory list." He disappeared into the supply container that served as temporary storage, came back with a clipboard and a plastic bin marked with Tommy's name and service number. Sarah's hands trembled when she took the bin. Inside was everything Tommy had been carrying: rifle, magazines, grenades, water, first aid kit, and helmet. She lifted the helmet. The camera mount was still attached to the side rail. The small black box that recorded everything a soldier saw. The Army had started issuing them 2 years ago. For training purposes, they said, to review tactics and improve performance. Really, it was for evidence. For the investigations that came after missions went wrong. For the footage that got analyzed by people who had not been there, who would judge every decision from the safety of offices thousands of miles away. Sarah pressed the power button. The camera was dead, battery drained or damaged, she could not tell which. Sullivan produced a small USB cable from his pocket, always prepared, always thinking 3 steps ahead. He connected the camera to a portable battery pack, waited. The camera's light flickered. Green. "Can you pull the footage?" Sarah asked. Sullivan connected a second cable to a laptop he had carried from the TOC. His fingers moved across the keyboard. Fast. Practiced. This was not the first time he had done this. The screen filled with video, shaky, chaotic but clear enough. They watched Tommy's last mission through his eyes, watched the approach to the compound, the entry, the first moments inside before the explosion. Sullivan froze the frame just before the blast. "There," he said, pointed at the screen. Sarah leaned closer. In the corner of the frame, barely visible in the dim interior light, was a wire, thin, professional, leading from the doorframe to something deeper in the structure. "That is not an IED," Sullivan said. "That is a breaching charge, military grade, the kind we use for controlled demolition." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. IEDs were crude, improvised, made from artillery shells and cell phone triggers and whatever the enemy could scavenge. They were effective but messy, unpredictable. This was precise, calculated, the kind of explosive that came from military stockpiles. "Keep going," she said. Sullivan advanced the footage, frame by frame, the explosion, the ceiling collapsing, Tommy's perspective tilting as he fell, then darkness, then nothing. The camera had survived, but the view was blocked by rubble. But in those frames before darkness, Sarah saw something else. A flash, not from the primary explosion, from outside, from the direction of the second attack. Sullivan saw it too. He enhanced the image, zoomed. The flash resolved into a muzzle blast, but not from an AK-47 or PKM or any of the weapons Iraqi insurgents typically used. "That is an M4, Sullivan said quietly, "American issue." They stared at the screen, at the evidence that could not be unseen. Someone with American weapons had been part of the ambush, had been coordinating with the insurgents, or had been the insurgents. "We need to show this to McCree," Sarah said. Sullivan ejected the USB drive, pocketed it. "Not yet. If we go to McCree now, Voss hears about it within the hour. This gets classified, disappears. We need copies, multiple copies, stored in places they cannot reach." "How?" Sullivan looked at Webb. The specialist was pretending not to listen, but his body language said he had heard everything. "Webb," Sullivan said, "how long until you rotate home?" Webb blinked. 3 weeks, Sergeant." "You have family stateside?" "Yes, Sergeant, wife and kid in Georgia." Sullivan pulled an envelope from his pocket, wrote an address on it. If anything happens to me or Sergeant Keller in the next 3 weeks, I need you to mail this envelope to this address. Can you do that?" Webb looked at the envelope. At Sullivan. At Sarah, 20 years old, smart enough to know he was being asked to participate in something that could end his career or save his life depending on which way the wind blew. "What is in it?" Webb asked. "Insurance," Sullivan said. "Nothing you need to know beyond that, but if we disappear, if we have accidents, if something happens that does not smell right, you mail it, understand?" Webb took the envelope, nodded slowly. "Yes, Sergeant." Sullivan slipped the USB drive into the envelope, sealed it, handed it back. 3 weeks, Sullivan said. "If nothing happens, burn it, but if something does, mail it, do not open it. Do not look at what is inside, just mail it." Webb put the envelope in his pocket. "I understand." They left him there with Tommy's gear and the weight of a secret he probably did not want. Sarah limped back toward her quarters. Sullivan walked beside her, silent, both of them processing what they had just seen. American weapons, military-grade explosives, precision timing. This was not insurgents getting lucky. This was not bad intelligence. This was something else, something that reached higher than Captain Voss, higher than Fob Eagle, higher than anything Sarah had clearance to imagine. "We are in trouble," she said. "Been in trouble since 2004, Sullivan replied. "Only difference now is we have proof." "Proof gets people killed," Sarah said. "So does silence," Sullivan answered. They reached Sarah's quarters. She sat on her bunk, leg throbbing despite the morphine, head spinning from implications she did not want to consider. Tommy was dead. But why he was dead was apparently a question with answers that people would kill to protect. Sullivan stood in the doorway. "Get some rest, Doc. Tomorrow we start digging," carefully. Sarah nodded. Sullivan left. She sat in the dark and stared at her hands. They were not shaking anymore. The morphine had done that. Or maybe she had finally run out of fear. Maybe there was a limit to how much terror one person could feel before the system just shut down and replaced emotion with cold assessment. She thought about her father, Joseph Keller, Medal of Honor, years of war. He had made choices that cost him, had chosen to save lives when protocol said abandon them, had been punished and honored in equal measure. Sarah reached under her bunk, pulled out the small wooden box she carried on every deployment. Inside was the medal, her father's medal. He had given it to her the day she enlisted, told her to carry it, told her it was not really his, told her it belonged to everyone who had ever made a choice that cost them something. She held the medal, felt the weight of it. The ribbon was faded, the bronze was tarnished, but the inscription was still clear, for valor beyond the call of duty. Her father was in a nursing home now. Dementia. Some days he knew her. Most days he thought she was a nurse, or a soldier, or someone from his past who had died decades ago. His mind was a battlefield where the past and present fought for territory and neither side ever won permanently. Sarah had visited him before this deployment, sat beside his bed, held his hand. He had looked at her with eyes that were clear for just a moment, had said something that made sense only now. "Baby girl," he had said, "when you find out the truth about something, when you learn that the people in charge lied, you have two choices: keep quiet and stay safe, or speak up and pay the price." "What did you choose?" Sarah had asked. He had smiled, sad, tired. "I chose to live with myself. Everything else is just consequence." Sarah set the medal back in the box, closed the lid. She understood now what her father had meant, understood the choice he had made decades ago, understood why he had carried guilt for so many years over decisions that had saved lives. Because the math never balanced, because saving people meant losing people, because every choice had a cost and you paid it whether you wanted to or not. Tommy Reed had made a choice, had pushed her to safety, had died under rubble. Sarah could honor that choice by staying quiet, by accepting the official story, by letting his death be listed as combat loss and moving on. Or she could honor it by making sure the truth came out, by making sure the people who set the trap paid for it, by making sure the next Tommy did not die because someone decided his life was acceptable math. She knew which choice her father would make, knew which choice Tommy would want her to make, knew which choice she could live with. Sarah pulled out paper and pen, started writing, not a letter, a statement, everything she knew, everything she had seen, everything Sullivan had told her. She documented it all, times, places, details, the kind of specifics that could not be easily dismissed. When she finished, she had 5 pages. She folded them, put them in an envelope, addressed it to her father's lawyer, a man she trusted, a man who would know what to do with evidence if something happened to her. Then she lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Sleep would not come. Pain was part of it. Fear was more of it. But mostly it was the knowledge that she had just crossed a line, had just become the kind of soldier who questioned orders, who investigated superiors, who chose truth over career. In the morning, everything would change. McCree would start his investigation. Voss would start her counterattack. The machine would start grinding, and Sarah would be caught in the gears along with Sullivan and anyone else who dared to ask why soldiers died on missions that smelled wrong from the start. 3 days until McCree retired. 3 days to find enough evidence to force an official inquiry. 3 days before the colonel who might protect them was gone, and they were alone against whatever was hiding in the classified spaces above their clearance level. Sarah closed her eyes, thought about Tommy, about Jensen, about the 7 who lived and the 1 who died, about difficult choices playing out in blood and dust in the cold mathematics of war. Somewhere in the TOC, Captain Voss was making a phone call, reporting that the debrief had gone as expected, that Sullivan had asked questions but nothing too dangerous, that the situation was contained. Somewhere in an office that did not officially exist, someone was listening to that report and deciding what to do next, whether to let it fade, whether to apply pressure, whether 32 lives had been enough or if more would be needed to keep the secret. Somewhere in North Carolina, Tommy Reed's mother was sleeping, still living in the world where her son was alive, still innocent of the grief that was traveling toward her at the speed of military notification protocols. And somewhere in the dark spaces between what was said and what was true, the real war was being fought, not between Americans and insurgents, between the people who believed soldiers' lives mattered and the people who believed some lives mattered less than others when the math demanded it. Sarah lay in the dark and waited for morning, waited for the moment when she would have to stand up and walk forward into whatever came next, waited for courage she was not sure she possessed. But courage, her father had taught her, was not the absence of fear. It was doing the right thing while afraid. It was choosing to speak when silence was safer. It was carrying the weight even when it was too heavy. She thought about the choices her father had made, the lives he had saved, the costs he had paid. She wondered if those he saved had grown up, had lived good lives, had known that someone had sacrificed everything to give them a chance. She would never know. The records were classified, the details buried, long enough for lives to happen, long enough for them to end. But her father had chosen to carry that weight, had chosen to believe every life was worth the cost, and he had carried that choice for decades without regret. Sarah could do the same, could carry Tommy, could carry the truth, could walk forward into the fire one more time. Because that was what it meant to be a medic in a war where the enemy was not always the one shooting at you. Outside her window, the desert night was silent, the kind of silence that came after battles, after decisions, after the moment when you committed to a path and could not turn back. Sarah lay in that silence and waited for dawn. When it came, she would be ready, or she would not, but either way she would stand up, would walk forward, would do what her father had taught her. She would choose to live with herself. Everything else was just consequence. The night stretched, the stars wheeled overhead, and in the darkness before dawn, Sarah Keller finally slept, not peacefully, not easily, but she slept. And dreamed of her father, of the choices he had made, of the weight he had carried, of a legacy that echoed across decades and landed here, in this desert, in this war, in this moment. The dream did not offer answers, only questions, only the weight of legacy and the burden of trying to live up to people who had made impossible choices and somehow survived them. When Sarah woke, the sun was rising. The desert was gold and red and beautiful in the way dangerous things often were. She sat up, tested her leg. It held, barely, but it held. She dressed, gathered her gear, walked out into the morning. Across the base, Sullivan was already awake, already moving, already preparing for what came next. In his quarters, McCree was writing another letter. "Dear Bate, I need to tell you something. This might be my last letter, not because of the enemy, because I am about to make a choice that will cost me everything I have built, but I am making it anyway, because some things matter more than retirement." And in the TOC, Voss was staring at her computer screen, at an email that had arrived overnight, at orders that were clear and cold and left no room for interpretation. Contain the situation, by any means necessary. She read it 3 times, then deleted it, then sat very still and wondered when she had become the kind of person who followed orders that got soldiers killed. The answer was simple, the same moment every soldier did, the moment they decided that following orders was easier than questioning them. But questioning was what separated soldiers from weapons, and Voss was learning that the line between the two was thinner than she had thought. The morning grew brighter, the base came alive, and 3 people who had decided to ask dangerous questions prepared to face whatever came next. They did not know it yet, but they were about to learn something that would change everything, something that would connect wars across generations, impossible choices echoing through time. They were about to learn that some ghosts never rested, some debts never cleared, and some truths were worth dying for even when dying changed nothing except the person who chose it. The sun climbed higher, the day began, and the last phoenix prepared to rise one more time. The Inspector General arrived at 0600 in a Black Hawk that kicked up enough dust to coat everything within 50 yards. Colonel Raymond Fisher stepped out wearing dress uniform and an expression that said he had seen this movie before and did not expect a happy ending. He was 62 years old. 3 years past retirement age, but still serving because the Army needed people who remembered when integrity meant something. Sarah watched from the aid station window as Fisher crossed the tarmac toward the TOC. McCree met him halfway. 2 colonels, 2 men who had given their lives to the institution and were about to test whether the institution deserved it. They shook hands, spoke briefly. McCree pointed toward the TOC. Fisher nodded. They walked together like pallbearers carrying something too heavy to name. Sullivan appeared beside Sarah, watched the same scene. His jaw was tight, hands steady. He had not slept. Neither had Sarah. Sleep was for people who were not walking into fire. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "Before Voss gets word that the IG is here." Sullivan checked his watch. "She probably already knows, before she acts on it. That depends on how desperate she is." How desperate are people who give orders to contain situations by any means necessary? Sullivan did not answer. Did not need to. They both knew the answer. Desperate enough to sacrifice 32 soldiers to protect a secret. Desperate enough to do it again if the secret was worth protecting. Sarah's leg ached. The morphine had worn off during the night and she had not taken more. She needed to be clear, sharp. Whatever happened today, she needed to see it coming. "Doc," Sullivan said quietly, "if this goes wrong, if they decide we are the problem instead of Voss, you need to be ready to run." "I am not running." "Then you need to be ready to fight, because they will come at us with lawyers and classifications and national security justifications. They will make us look crazy, paranoid, traumatized. They will use our own service records against us." Sarah thought about her medical file, the PTSD diagnosis from 3 years ago, the sleep medication, the mandatory counseling sessions she had attended because you could not deploy without them. All of it documented, all of it ammunition for anyone who wanted to discredit her testimony. "Let them try," she said. Sullivan looked at her, saw something in her face that made him nod. "Okay then, let us go to war." They walked across the base toward the TOC. The morning sun was already hot. By noon it would be brutal, but they would not be here at noon. One way or another, this would be over before the day got old. Inside the TOC, McCree had assembled everyone who mattered. Fisher sat at the head of the table. Voss stood to one side, tablet in hand, face neutral. David was there, along with the other platoon leaders, the battalion sergeant major, the intelligence section, everyone who had touched the mission or had clearance to know what happened. Sarah and Sullivan took seats in the back, observers, witnesses, ghosts waiting to speak. Fisher opened a leather folder, removed reading glasses, put them on with the careful precision of someone who did everything by procedure because procedure was armor against accusations of bias. "Colonel McCree has requested a formal inquiry into the intelligence protocols surrounding Operation Phantom Sweep," Fisher began. His voice was rough, worn by decades of giving orders and taking blame, specifically regarding the accuracy of threat assessments and the verification procedures used prior to mission execution. He looked at Voss. "Captain, you were the operations officer responsible for intelligence verification. Walk me through your process." Voss stepped forward, set her tablet on the table, tapped the screen. A satellite image appeared on the main display. The compound, the same building where Tommy had died. "Sir, intelligence came from 3 sources. First, signals intercept indicating enemy communications originating from this structure. Second, human intelligence from a local source identifying the location as a safe house. Third, pattern analysis showing increased activity consistent with high-value target presence." Fisher made notes, timing of these intercepts. Signals intelligence was gathered 48 hours prior to mission. Human was confirmed 24 hours prior. Pattern analysis was ongoing. And verification protocols. Standard triple source verification, Voss said. All 3 intelligence streams pointed to the same conclusion: minimal security, high-value target, time-sensitive window. Fisher looked up from his notes. "Captain, were you aware that in 2004 a similar intelligence package resulted in the complete loss of a Delta Force team?" The room went silent. Voss's face did not change, but Sarah saw her fingers tighten on the tablet. "Sir, I was not the operations officer for that mission. I was assigned to the task force but not directly responsible for intelligence verification." "But you were present," Fisher said. "You had access to the same intelligence channels, the same verification protocols. And yet, A 12-man team walked into an ambush because someone told them the intelligence was solid. Voss held Fisher's gaze. Sir, that mission was reviewed. Findings were classified, but the conclusion was that the enemy had sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities. No fault was assigned to intelligence personnel. No fault was assigned, Fisher repeated. Interesting choice of words. Not that no fault existed, just that none was assigned. He turned to Sullivan. Sergeant Sullivan, you were the sole survivor of that 2004 mission. Do you believe the intelligence was accurate? Sullivan stood, walked to the front of the room. His movements were economical, precise, like a man who had learned to waste nothing because waste meant death. No, sir, Sullivan said. I do not believe the intelligence was accurate. I believe it was deliberately falsified or selectively reported. I believe someone wanted that mission to fail. That is a serious accusation, Sergeant. Yes, sir. I have lived with it for 2 years, tried to report it after the mission. Was told I was traumatized, unreliable, that my memories were compromised by survivor guilt. And now, Sullivan pulled a USB drive from his pocket, set it on the table. Now I have evidence. Fisher picked up the drive, examined it. What is this? Helmet camera footage from Private First Class Tommy Reed, recorded during Operation Phantom Sweep. It shows the explosive device that trapped personnel inside the structure, military grade, professionally placed. It also shows muzzle flashes from outside, M4 pattern, American weapons. The room erupted, officers talking over each other, demanding to see the footage, demanding explanations. Fisher raised one hand, silence fell. Captain Voss, Fisher said quietly, do you have any explanation for why American weapons would be present at an ambush site? Voss had gone pale, not much, just enough to notice if you were watching carefully. Sarah was watching very carefully. Sir, without seeing the footage I cannot comment. But if American weapons were present, it could indicate captured equipment. The enemy has been known to acquire our weapons through various means. Or, Sullivan said, it could indicate American personnel were present, either as prisoners being forced to cooperate, or as active participants. You are suggesting, Voss said, her voice going cold, that American soldiers were involved in killing other American soldiers. I am suggesting, Sullivan said, that the footage shows what it shows, and that someone should explain it. Fisher inserted the USB drive into a laptop. The screen filled with Tommy's last mission. Everyone watched in silence, watched the approach, the entry, the wire, the explosion, the muzzle flash. Fisher froze the frame, enhanced the image. The muzzle flash was clear, unmistakable, M4 firing pattern, not AK-47, not PKM, not any weapon insurgents typically used. He turned to Voss. Captain, this requires explanation. Voss stared at the screen. Her composure was cracking, not breaking, just cracking, small fissures appearing in the professional facade. Sir, I would need to review this with my intelligence team. Determine if there were any friendly forces in the area who might have been engaging the same target from a different position. At 0900 when we launched, Fisher said, what friendly forces were operating in eastern Ramadi at that time? Voss hesitated. None that I am aware of. Then who fired that weapon? The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy, toxic, impossible to ignore. Voss looked at the screen, at the frozen image of muzzle flash, at the evidence that could not be explained away with classifications and protocol. Sir, she said slowly, I believe this matter involves operational security beyond this forum. I request that we continue this inquiry in a classified setting. Denied, Fisher said. These men died. They deserve answers that are not buried in classification. Continue. Voss straightened. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Gone was the careful professional tone. What emerged was something harder, colder, the voice of someone who had made peace with difficult choices. Sir, some operations require sacrifice. Require soldiers to take risks that appear unjustified in the moment but serve larger strategic objectives. Those objectives are classified for reasons that protect ongoing operations and save lives in the aggregate. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. The cold certainty that they had been right, that Voss had known, that Tommy had died not by accident or enemy action but by deliberate choice. McCree stood, his voice was quiet, deadly. Captain, are you telling me that you sent my men into a trap, knowingly? Voss met his eyes. I am telling you, sir, that I follow orders, that those orders come from authority above this base, above this theater, above anything you or I have clearance to question. Fisher removed his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth he pulled from his pocket. The gesture was slow, deliberate, buying time to process what he had just heard. Captain Voss, Fisher said, are you stating that Operation Phantom Sweep was deliberately compromised to serve classified objectives? I am stating, Voss said, that some missions have objectives beyond the stated goals, that soldiers sometimes die protecting secrets they will never know existed. This is unfortunate but necessary. Who gave you these orders? Fisher asked. That information is classified above your clearance level, sir, and mine. I receive taskings through secured channels. I execute them. That is the chain of command. The chain of command, McCree said, does not include the authority to sacrifice American soldiers for classified operations without their knowledge or consent. Sir, Voss said, with respect, the chain of command includes exactly that authority when national security requires it. You know this. You have made similar choices in your career. We all have. Sarah watched McCree's face, saw the impact of Voss's words, saw him confronting the truth that she was right, that every commander made choices that got soldiers killed. That war was math, and someone always ended up on the wrong side of the equation. But there was a difference between losing soldiers in combat and spending them like currency, between acceptable risk and acceptable sacrifice. The difference was consent, agency, the knowledge that you were walking into danger for a reason you understood. Tommy had not known. None of them had known. They had trusted the intelligence, trusted their officers, trusted that the chain of command had their interests at heart. And they had been wrong. Fisher stood, walked to the window, looked out at Fob Eagle, at the soldiers moving through their morning routines, at the flags and barriers and sandbags that created the illusion of safety in a place where safety did not exist. When he turned back, his face was stone. Captain Voss, you are relieved of duty pending investigation. You will surrender your weapon and security credentials. You will confine yourself to quarters under guard. You will speak to no one without counsel present. Voss did not react, did not protest, just nodded once. McCree, Fisher said, you have 48 hours to compile a complete record of this mission. I want every communication, every order, every classification marking. If there are people above Captain Voss in this chain, I want their names. Sir, McCree said, some of those names are probably classified above both our clearance levels. Then we get clearance, Fisher said, or we go to Congress, or we go to the press, because I am not burying this, not after what I just heard. He looked at Sullivan, at Sarah, at the other soldiers in the room. If anyone in this room has additional evidence or testimony, You will provide it to Colonel McCree within 24 hours. If anyone attempts to interfere with this investigation or intimidate witnesses, you will report it immediately. This is not a request. This is an order." The room emptied slowly, officers filing out, whispering, processing, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Sarah and Sullivan remained. Voss was being escorted out by 2 MPs. She caught Sarah's eye as she passed. No anger, no hatred, just a look that said you have no idea what you have started. Maybe they did not. Maybe they were about to learn that some secrets were protected by people who had more resources and fewer scruples than anyone in this room could imagine. But they had started it anyway, because Tommy deserved it, because the 12 Delta operators deserved it, because every soldier who had ever died trusting bad intelligence deserved someone to ask why. McCree approached them. His face was drawn, exhausted. He looked older than 60, looked like a man who had just spent everything he had built over 34 years. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for having the courage to bring this forward." Sir Sullivan said, "You know what happens now. They will come after us, all of us." "Let them," McCree said. "I have 48 hours until retirement. I plan to use every minute." He walked out. David appeared from where he had been standing in the back of the room. His face was pale, shocked. "Dad," David said, "is it true? Did they deliberately send us into a trap?" McCree stopped, turned, looked at his son, at the lieutenant who had just lost his first soldier and was now learning that the loss had been calculated, planned, acceptable. "Yes," McCree said, "I believe they did." "Why?" "I do not know yet, but I am going to find out." Father and son looked at each other. Sarah saw the weight pass between them, the burden of knowledge, the end of innocence. David had started this deployment believing in the mission, believing the cause was just and the leadership was honorable. Now he knew better. Now he knew what his father had learned slowly over 34 years. That institutions were made of people. That people made choices. That some of those choices were made for reasons that had nothing to do with honor or duty or the lives of the people who executed them. David nodded slowly, walked away, shoulders bent under weight they had not carried yesterday. Sarah limped outside. The sun was higher now, hotter. The day was progressing toward noon whether anyone was ready or not. Sullivan appeared beside her, handed her water. She drank. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Sullivan said, "we wait. Fisher will investigate. McCree will compile evidence. And somewhere in an office we will never see, someone will decide how to respond." "You think they will let this go to trial?" "No," Sullivan said. "I think they will find a way to classify it, to bury it, to make us look like conspiracy theorists or traumatized veterans who cannot be trusted." "Then why did we do this?" Sullivan looked at the desert, at the sky, at the place where earth met heaven in a line so straight it looked like a promise that was never kept. "Because Tommy deserved someone to ask why," Sullivan said. "Because in 2004 12 men died and nobody asked. Because if we do not ask, nobody will." Sarah nodded, understood. This was not about winning, was not about justice, was about refusing to let silence be the final answer. They walked back toward their quarters. The base was alive with rumors now. Everyone had heard something. Nobody knew everything. The story was mutating, growing, becoming legend before it had even finished being truth. In her quarters, Sarah found an envelope slid under her door. No markings, no return address. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper, typed, anonymous. "You have made powerful enemies. They will come for you, not with violence, with paperwork, with medical discharges. with questions about your stability and fitness for duty. They will use your PTSD diagnosis, your medication. They will make you disappear quietly. If you want to survive this, stop asking questions. Accept the official story. Move on. This is not a threat. This is advice from someone who has seen how this ends. Sarah read it twice, then burned it in the metal trash can by her bunk, watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. She was not stopping, could not stop, because stopping meant Tommy died for nothing, meant his mother would never know the truth, meant the next group of soldiers would walk into the next trap and the cycle would continue. Someone knocked. Sarah opened the door. Specialist Webb stood there, young, nervous, holding the envelope Sullivan had given him. "Ma'am," Webb said, "I heard what happened in the TOC. Heard the IG is investigating." Sarah waited. "I still have this," Webb said, holding up the envelope. "Still planning to mail it if something happens to you or Sergeant Sullivan." Sarah looked at the envelope, at the insurance policy, at the 20-year-old specialist who had chosen a side without fully understanding what he was choosing. "Thank you, Webb," she said. "Ma'am," Webb said, "my dad served. Iraq, first deployment, 2003. He told me once that the hardest part was not the fighting, it was knowing when to fight and when to walk away." "What did he choose?" "He fought," Webb said. "Got himself court-martialed for refusing an order he thought was going to get his squad killed. Turned out he was right. Order was based on bad intel. But he still got court-martialed, still lost his career." Webb looked down at the envelope, then back at Sarah. "He told me he would do it again," Webb said. "Told me some things were worth losing everything for. Told me you had to be able to look at yourself in the mirror." Sarah felt tears threaten, pushed them back. Not now, not yet. There would be time for tears later, after, if there was an after. "Your father sounds like a good man," Sarah said. "He was," Webb said. "Died 2 years ago. Heart attack. But he died knowing he had done the right thing. That counts for something." He handed the envelope to Sarah. "I am mailing this today," he said. "Not waiting 3 weeks. Not giving them time to get to me. Whatever is on that drive, it is going somewhere they cannot touch it." "Webb," Sarah said, "if you do this, they will come after you too." "I know, ma'am, but my dad taught me how to look in the mirror. I would like to keep that skill." He saluted, walked away. 20 years old, making choices that would define the rest of his life, choosing courage over safety, truth over career. Sarah watched him go and wondered how many others would make the same choice. How many would stand up when standing up meant risking everything? She would find out soon enough, because the next 48 hours would determine whether this investigation went forward or disappeared into classification and denial. In the TOC, McCree was compiling files. Every communication, every intelligence report, every classification marking, building the case, creating the record. Fisher was making phone calls, calling in favors, activating networks built over 40 years of service, preparing for the fight he knew was coming. And somewhere in an office that did not officially exist, someone was reading reports, making decisions, calculating whether containing this situation required pressure or elimination, whether witnesses could be discredited or needed to be disappeared. The war had changed. It was no longer Americans versus insurgents. It was truth versus secrecy, accountability versus expediency. The people who believed soldiers' lives mattered versus the people who believed some lives mattered less when the mission required it. Sarah sat on her bunk, looked at her hands. They were not shaking anymore, had not shaken since she made the choice to fight. Maybe that was the secret. Maybe fear only controlled you when you had something left to lose, Once you decided to risk everything, fear lost its power, became just information, just noise. She thought about her father, about the choice he had made decades ago, about carrying weight through dangerous places while people shot at him, about choosing lives over protocol and spending years carrying the weight of that choice. He had told her once, in a lucid moment near the end, that he did not regret it, that the weight was heavy but the alternative would have been heavier, that living with yourself mattered more than what other people thought. Sarah understood now, understood that this was her moment, her choice. She would carry it, however heavy it got, however long it took. Because that was what it meant to be the kind of person who chose right over easy. Outside, the sun climbed toward its peak, the heat built, the day stretched. And across Fob Eagle, people made choices. Some chose silence, some chose courage, some chose to wait and see which way the wind blew. But Sarah Keller and Marcus Sullivan, and James McCree and Raymond Fisher, and David McCree and Specialist Marcus Webb had already chosen. They had chosen to ask why, to demand answers, to refuse to let silence be the final word. They did not know if they would win, did not know if the truth would come out or get buried under classifications and national security justifications. But they knew they had tried, had refused to walk away, had stood up when standing up meant risking everything. And sometimes Sarah thought that was enough, not to win, just to try, just to refuse to let the ghosts go unavenged. Tommy Reed, the 12 Delta operators, every soldier who had ever died trusting intelligence that was not trustworthy, leaders who did not lead, orders that should not have been given. They deserved someone to ask why. They deserved someone to refuse the easy answer. Sarah stood, walked outside into the heat. The sun was brutal. The desert was beautiful and terrible. She looked at the sky, at the endless blue, at the place where jets left contrails that faded to nothing. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, answers or cover-ups, justice or classification, truth or expedient lies. But today she had done what she could, had stood up, had spoken, had refused to be silent. That would have to be enough, because it was all she had. The desert wind blew hot across her face. Sarah closed her eyes, breathed, and waited for the fire to come. 6 months later, the hearing room in Washington smelled like old wood and older secrets. Sarah Keller sat in the third row wearing dress uniform she had not touched since her promotion ceremony 3 years ago. The ribbons felt heavy, the collar too tight. She was not used to being clean anymore, not used to air conditioning and carpet and the kind of silence that came from expensive soundproofing instead of desert emptiness. Beside her, Marcus Sullivan sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes forward, the same 1,000-yard stare he had worn for 2 years before Iraq and would probably wear for the rest of his life. Some distances could not be traveled back from. The Senate Armed Services Committee had convened in closed session. Classified. No press. No public record. Just senators and witnesses and the weight of questions that had taken 6 months to reach this room. Senator Patricia Graham called the session to order. She was 70 years old, gray hair pulled back severe, eyes that had seen 3 wars and trusted none of the official explanations. She had buried a son in Afghanistan. That kind of loss made you skeptical of people who talked about acceptable casualties. "We are here," Graham began, "to examine the events of December 7th, 2006. Operation Phantom Sweep, 1 killed in action, 7 wounded, and allegations of intelligence failures that may constitute criminal negligence or worse." She looked at the empty chair at the witness table. Captain Alina Voss had been scheduled to testify, had been subpoenaed, had failed to appear. The committee has been informed, Graham continued, that Captain Voss is unavailable due to medical circumstances. She has been admitted to Walter Reed's psychiatric ward under involuntary commitment. Her counsel has invoked her Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. Medical circumstances, psychiatric ward, involuntary commitment. The exact playbook the anonymous letter had warned about. They had come after Voss the same way they would have come after Sarah and Sullivan if Fisher had not moved fast enough. Voss had been disappeared, not with violence, with diagnoses and medications and locked doors. She would never testify, never confirm what she had said in that TOC, never provide the names of the people who had given her orders. The conspiracy would stay hidden, protected by classifications and the convenient mental breakdown of the one person who could have exposed it. Colonel Raymond Fisher took the witness chair. He had retired 4 months ago, could have walked away, could have let this die in the machinery of military bureaucracy. Instead, he had spent his retirement fighting, calling senators, providing evidence, refusing to let silence be the answer. Senator Fisher said, "I have compiled 400 pages of documentation regarding Operation Phantom Sweep, intelligence reports, communications logs, after-action reviews. All of it points to a pattern of deliberate misinformation." Graham accepted the folder Fisher slid across the table. "Do you have direct evidence that Captain Voss knowingly sent soldiers into an ambush?" Fisher hesitated. That hesitation told Sarah everything. He had evidence, but not the kind that would survive in court, not the kind that could overcome classifications and national security objections. "Senator, I have helmet camera footage showing military-grade explosives and American weapons signatures at the ambush site. I have testimony from Sergeant Sullivan regarding a similar pattern in 2004. I have statistical analysis showing probability of such coordinated ambushes occurring by chance is less than 0.01%. "But you do not have orders," Graham said quietly. "You do not have communications showing deliberate compromise of the mission." "No, Senator. Those communications are classified above my clearance level, above yours, above anyone on this committee." "Then we have a problem," Graham said, "because without direct evidence of criminal intent, we are left with incompetence. And incompetence, while tragic, is not prosecutable." Sarah watched Fisher's shoulders slump, watched him realize what she had known for 6 months. They had evidence of the crime but not proof of the criminals. They had dead soldiers but no one to hold accountable. They had truth but not justice. The hearing continued for 3 hours. Witnesses testified. Sullivan described the 2004 mission in clinical detail. David McCree explained the tactical situation. Medical personnel confirmed the nature of the explosives and weapon patterns. But none of it mattered, because the people who had given the orders were hidden behind classifications, and the one person who could identify them was locked in a psychiatric ward at Walter Reed, medicated into silence. When it ended, Graham gavelled the session closed. Findings would be issued within 30 days. Recommendations would be made. The machinery would grind. But Sarah knew what those findings would say. Intelligence failure, lessons learned, improved protocols, maybe a letter of reprimand in someone's file, maybe a quiet retirement with full benefits. Nothing that would bring Tommy back. Nothing that would give his mother answers she could understand. Nothing that would prevent the next group of soldiers from walking into the next trap. Outside the hearing room, Fisher caught up with Sarah and Sullivan. His face was gray, exhausted. "I am sorry," he said. "I thought we had enough. Thought the evidence would be compelling enough to force accountability." "You did everything you could," Sarah said. more than most would have. It was not enough, Fisher said. No, sir, Sullivan said, but you gave us something. You gave us a record, documentation that cannot be erased. Someday, maybe not today, someone will read that record and know the truth. Fisher nodded, shook their hands, walked away looking older than 62, looking like a man who had just learned that 40 years of service had not earned him enough credibility to challenge the people who made the rules. Sarah and Sullivan stood on the steps of the Senate building. Washington in June was humid, heavy, the kind of heat that pressed down like a physical weight. Behind them, the marble and columns and all the architecture of democracy. In front of them, the city where decisions got made that soldiers paid for in blood. So that is it, Sarah said. We lose. We do not lose, Sullivan said. We just do not win. There is a difference. Sarah did not see it, but she was too tired to argue. 6 months of depositions and interviews and reliving the worst day of her life had left her hollowed out. She had given everything. It had not been enough. Her phone buzzed, text message, unknown number. You tried, that matters. Some of us remember. Sarah showed it to Sullivan. He read it, nodded. Webb, Sullivan said, has to be. He is the only one who would send something like that. Specialist Marcus Webb had mailed the envelope. The evidence had reached newspapers, reached Congress, reached people who cared. It had not been enough to prosecute, but it had been enough to ask questions, to force the hearing, to make the system acknowledge that something had been wrong even if no one could be held accountable. That was something, not justice, but something. Sarah took the metro back to her hotel, small, cheap, government rate. She had been in Washington for 2 weeks preparing for testimony, would leave tomorrow, go back to Fort Bragg, back to teaching combat medics, back to the job she had built after Iraq. In her room, she sat on the bed and stared at the medal in her hands. Her father's medal, Medal of Honor, for valor beyond the call of duty. She had carried it to Iraq, had carried it home, had carried it here. Joseph Keller had died 3 months ago. Pneumonia. His body had finally given up the fight his mind had lost years before. Sarah had been at his bedside, had held his hand, had watched him slip away without ever fully coming back from the wars he had fought. His last words had been clear, though, lucid, like the disease had released him for just a moment before the end. "Did you save them?" he had asked. "I tried," Sarah had said. "Then you did," Joseph had answered. Now she understood what he meant. The trying was the point, refusing to quit, standing up even when standing up cost you everything. She had done that, had testified, had risked her career, had spent 6 months fighting a system designed to protect itself. And she had lost, but she had tried. Her phone rang. "McCree," she answered. "Sergeant," his voice was tired. "I heard about the hearing. I am sorry." "You and me both, sir." "I want you to know," McCree said, "what you did mattered, what Sullivan did, what all of us did, even if the outcome was not what we wanted." "Did it matter to Tommy?" Sarah asked. "Did it matter to his mother?" McCree was silent for a moment. "I visited her," he said finally, "last month. Told her what really happened. Told her Tommy died a hero, but that the people who sent him there knew it was a trap." "What did she say?" "She thanked me. Said it hurt less knowing someone had tried to hold them accountable. Said it would have hurt more if we had just accepted the official story." Sarah closed her eyes, felt tears threaten, pushed them back. "How are you, sir?" she asked. "Retired," McCree said. "Official as of 3 months ago. Pension intact. No court-martial, no reprimand. They could not punish me without explaining why, and they did not want to explain why." "So you won?" "No," McCree said. "I survived. There is a difference. David is still in. Made captain last month. He is a good officer, better than I was at his age. Knows the difference between following orders and doing right. That is because of you, Sarah said. That is because of what happened, McCree corrected. Because he saw what happened when you trust the system more than you trust your conscience. They talked for a few more minutes, about nothing important, about the weather and duty stations and all the small talk that soldiers used to avoid talking about the things that actually mattered. Then McCree said goodbye, said he hoped she would stay in, said the Army needed people like her. Sarah was not sure the Army deserved people like her, but she would stay anyway, because teaching medics was how she honored Tommy, was how she made sure the next generation knew that following orders was not enough, that you had to think, question, refuse when refusing was the only moral choice. She packed her bag, checked out of the hotel, took a cab to Reagan National. The flight to North Carolina left at 6. She would be home by 9, would sleep in her own bed, would wake up tomorrow and go back to work. At the airport, she saw Sullivan. He was flying to Colorado, back to family he had not seen in 2 years, back to a life he had put on hold to fight this fight. They sat together at the gate, watching planes take off and land, watching people come and go, living their lives without knowing about classified operations and acceptable casualties and the cost of secrets. You ever wonder, Sullivan said, if we should have just stayed quiet? Every day, Sarah said, but then I remember Tommy's face, remember him pushing me toward the exit, remember that he died believing we were the good guys. We are the good guys, Sullivan said. Are we? Sarah asked. We lost. Voss is in a psychiatric hospital. The people who gave the orders are still giving orders. Nothing changed. Something changed, Sullivan said. We changed. We know now. And knowing means we can never go back to pretending the system is perfect, that every order is righteous, that soldiers dying is always worth it. Sarah thought about that, about how innocence once lost could never be reclaimed, about how knowledge was a burden you carried forever. Maybe that was the point. Maybe winning was never the goal. The goal was bearing witness, refusing to forget, making sure the dead were remembered by people who knew their deaths had meant something even if that something was just proving the system was broken. Her flight boarded, she said goodbye to Sullivan, did not know if she would see him again, hoped she would, hoped he found peace in Colorado, hoped his family could help him carry the weight. On the plane, Sarah sat by the window, watched Washington shrink below her, watched the monuments and buildings become tiny, insignificant. From altitude, everything looked small, even the places where empires rose and fell. She closed her eyes, slept, dreamed of Tommy, of Jensen, of all the soldiers she had saved and the ones she had not, of her father carrying weight through dangerous places, of Sullivan lying under corpses for 6 hours, of McCree writing letters he could not finish. When she woke, they were descending into Raleigh. The sun was setting. The sky was orange and purple and beautiful in the way endings often were. At baggage claim, she saw a young woman holding a sign, Sergeant Keller. The woman was maybe 25, blonde, wearing jeans and a Fort Bragg sweatshirt. Sarah approached. I am Keller. The woman smiled. I am Emma Jensen. My dad asked me to pick you up. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Emma Jensen, the 2-year-old daughter whose father Sarah had saved, who was alive because Tommy had died. He wanted to thank you, Emma said, for saving him. Said he has been trying to reach you for 6 months, but you were always deployed or traveling. He does not need to thank me, Sarah said. He says he does, says you gave him his life back, gave me my dad. They drove to Fort Bragg. Emma talked about college, about her father, about how he had retired from the army after Iraq, how he worked construction now, how he talked about that day sometimes, about the medic who pulled him out of the building. "Your hands were shaking," Emma said. "That is what Dad remembers most. Your hands were shaking, but you kept working." "They always shake," Sarah said. "Dad says that is how he knew you cared. Said if your hands had been steady, it would have meant you had done it too many times, that you had stopped feeling it." Sarah looked out the window, at the North Carolina pine trees, at the familiar landscape of a place she had left and returned to so many times she could not remember which was home anymore. Emma dropped her at her apartment. Sarah thanked her, watched her drive away, then climbed the stairs to her door. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. Clean, sparse, the apartment of someone who lived out of duffel bags and never stayed anywhere long enough to accumulate things that mattered. She set down her bag, sat on the couch, stared at the wall. The hearing was over. The fight was done. She had testified, had told the truth, had tried to hold people accountable. And nothing had changed except her. She was different now. Knew things she wished she did not know, carried weight she had not chosen but could not set down. Her phone buzzed. Email. Subject line, Fort Bragg assignment notification. Sarah opened it. Read it twice to make sure she understood. "Sergeant First Class Keller, you are hereby assigned as Senior Instructor, Combat Medic School, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. You will be responsible for curriculum development and training oversight for all combat medic students. This assignment reflects your exemplary service and dedication to the medical corps." At the bottom was a note, handwritten, scanned. "Sergeant Keller, we need people like you teaching the next generation. People who know that medicine is not just technique, it is judgment, moral courage, the willingness to question orders when orders put patients at risk. I served with your father in 1989. He taught me what it meant to be a medic. Now you can do the same. Colonel Raymond Fisher." Sarah set down her phone, stared at the wall, felt something that might have been hope or might have been exhaustion, hard to tell the difference anymore. She would teach, would train the next generation, would make sure they knew that saving lives sometimes meant risking your own, that following protocol was not enough, that you had to think, feel, care. Would make sure they knew about Tommy Reed, about the private who died saving his medic, about the choice he made in a collapsing building that changed everything. The next morning, Sarah reported to the combat medic school. The building was new, modern, all glass and steel and the kind of architecture that was supposed to inspire confidence in American military medicine. Inside, 40 students sat in classroom seats, young faces, eager, scared, all of them volunteers, all of them choosing to run toward danger instead of away from it. Sarah stood at the front, looked at them, saw herself 17 years ago, saw Tommy, saw every young medic who had ever believed courage and training were enough. "My name is Sergeant First Class Sarah Keller," she began. "I have 17 years as a combat medic, 3 deployments, more patients than I can count. I have saved lives. I have lost lives. Both will haunt you forever." The students shifted, uncomfortable. This was not the speech they expected. They expected inspiration, motivation, the promise that they would save everyone if they tried hard enough. Sarah would not lie to them, would not set them up for the guilt she carried. "You will shake," she continued. "Your hands will shake, your voice will shake, everything in you will scream to run, and you will stay anyway. You will kneel in the blood and the chaos and you will work. That is what makes you a medic." She paused, let that sink in. "But here is what they do not teach you in school," Sarah said. "Sometimes you will be sent into situations where someone knew it was a trap, where your life was considered acceptable risk, where the people giving orders made calculations that did not include your name, just your rank, your specialty, your replaceability. The room was silent now, students leaning forward, listening. When that happens, Sarah said, you have two choices. Follow orders and hope it works out, or question orders and risk your career. There is no easy answer, no protocol for moral courage. You have to decide what you can live with. She walked to the whiteboard, wrote a name, Private First Class Tommy Reed. This soldier died saving my life, Sarah said. He was 23, had never been in combat before, was scared. But when the building collapsed and I was trapped, he came back. He chose. Sarah turned to face the students. His choice cost him everything, but it taught me something. That courage is not about being fearless. It is about being terrified and acting anyway. It is about knowing the cost and paying it because the alternative is worse. She let them sit with that, let them process, then continued. You will lose patience. You will make mistakes. You will carry guilt for deaths that were not your fault, but you will also save lives. You will pull people back from the edge. You will give families their sons and daughters and fathers and mothers, and that is why we do this. The first day of class was technique, tourniquet application, wound packing, airway management, all the mechanical skills that could be taught and tested and graded. But between the technique lessons, Sarah told stories about Jensen, about the 7 who lived, about Tommy, about the choices that defined moments. The students listened. Some of them understood immediately. Others would understand later, after their first patient, after their first loss, after the moment when theory became reality and they learned what it meant to hold a life in shaking hands. Weeks became months. The students graduated. New classes arrived. Sarah taught them all, made sure every single one knew about Tommy, about the private who became a hero in a moment, who proved that courage was not about rank or experience or any of the things the Army measured. 6 months after the hearing, Sarah received a letter, handwritten, return address in North Carolina. Sergeant Keller, it began, you do not know me. My name is Patricia Reed. I am Tommy's mother. Sarah's hands shook as she read. Colonel McCree visited me, told me what happened, told me you tried to save Tommy, that you were trapped under the beam and he came back for you, that his last act was pushing you to safety. I wanted to thank you, not for surviving, for fighting, for trying to hold people accountable, for refusing to let my son's death be just another line in a report. I know the hearing did not go the way you hoped. I know the people responsible are still free, but you made them answer questions. You made them sweat. You made sure Tommy's death meant something. That is all a mother can ask for, that her son's life mattered, that his death was not in vain, that someone cared enough to fight. Thank you, Sergeant Keller. Thank you for being the kind of person my son died protecting. Thank you for making his sacrifice mean something. The letter was signed. Below the signature was a photograph, Tommy in dress uniform, smiling, young, alive. Sarah set the letter on her desk, looked at the photo, saw the kid who had asked her if fear was normal, who had filmed his last mission on a helmet camera that became evidence, who had made a choice in a moment that changed everything. She would keep the letter, would keep the photo, would make sure every class saw it, knew his name, understood what he represented. Not heroism in the abstract, not the sanitized version they put in training videos, but real courage, messy, terrified, human. The kind of courage that came from ordinary people in impossible situations, who chose to act when inaction was safer. A year after Iraq, Sarah visited Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, the rows of white headstones marking the wars that never seemed to end. She found Tommy's grave. The stone was simple: name, rank, date of birth, date of death. Bronze star with V device for valor. She knelt, set flowers, white roses. Tommy's mother had mentioned in a follow-up letter that they were his favorite. I kept my promise, Sarah said to the stone. Fought as hard as I could, did not win, but I tried. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere a flag snapped against its pole. The sound was sharp, clean, like a salute. Sarah sat for a long time, thinking about promises and costs, about the weight of survival, about how you honored the dead by living in a way that made their sacrifice mean something. She thought about her father, about the choices he had made, about whether the people he had saved had lived good lives, whether Joseph Keller's choices had mattered. She would never know, but her father had made those choices anyway, had carried the weight, had lived with it for decades without regret. Sarah could do the same, could carry Tommy, could teach in his name, could make sure the next generation knew that following orders was not enough, that you had to think, question, choose. She stood, saluted the grave, turned to leave. As she walked through the rows of white stones, she passed other visitors, other people carrying flowers and grief and the weight of loss, all of them connected by the same thread, all of them trying to honor people who died in service to something larger than themselves. Sarah did not know if that something was always worth it, did not know if any cause justified the cost these stones represented, but she knew the people buried here had believed it was worth it, had chosen to serve, had paid the price. That choice deserved honor, even when the cause was unclear, even when the orders were wrong, even when the system failed them. Because the people buried here were not the system, they were individuals who made choices, some good, some bad, all of them human. Sarah left Arlington as the sun set. The sky was orange and gold, and the white stones glowed in the fading light like candles, like vigil, like memory made visible. She drove back to Fort Bragg, back to her apartment, back to the life she had built from the pieces of who she used to be. That night she sat at her desk and wrote, not a letter, a curriculum, a training module on ethical decision-making for combat medics, on the difference between following orders and doing right, on how to recognize when intelligence was wrong and leaders were compromised and you had to trust your conscience over the chain of command. She wrote about Tommy, about Sullivan, about the 12 Delta operators, about her father and the choices that echoed across generations. She wrote until her hands cramped, until the words blurred, until she had documented everything she had learned in 17 years about what it meant to be a medic in a war where the enemy was not always the one shooting at you. When she finished, it was 3 in the morning. The apartment was dark. The world was quiet. Sarah saved the document, sent it to the commandant of the medical school, knew it would probably get rejected, knew it was too honest, too raw, too willing to question the sacred cows of military medicine. But she sent it anyway, because refusing to be silent was the point, making sure the truth was available to anyone willing to look for it. 3 days later, the commandant called her to his office. Colonel Williams, 30 years of service, silver hair, eyes that had seen enough to be skeptical of anything that looked too clean. Sergeant Keller, he said, I read your curriculum proposal. Sarah waited, ready for rejection, ready to fight. It is approved, Williams said. We will implement it next semester, make it mandatory for all combat medic students. Sarah stared at him, sir. The military needs medics who think, Williams said, who question, who understand that medicine is not just following protocols. It is judgment, moral courage, the willingness to refuse when refusal is the only right answer. He handed her a folder, your testimony, your fight. That took courage most people do not have. That is the kind of courage we should be teaching. Thank you, sir, Sarah said. Williams nodded. Your father would be proud. How did you know about my father? Williams smiled. Joseph Keller, Medal of Honor. I served with him, briefly. 89, Fort Sam Houston. He taught me that being a medic meant sometimes you had to fight your own side. Fight the people who thought medicine was about triage and acceptable losses. He taught me that every life mattered, even when the math said otherwise. Sarah could not speak, could only nod. He would be proud, Williams repeated, of what you did, of what you are doing, of who you are. After the meeting, Sarah walked across the base, past the training fields where young soldiers learned to march and shoot and follow orders, past the ranges where they learned to kill, past the medical building where they learned to save. She thought about legacy, about what got passed down, about how her father's choices had somehow led to her choices, about how both had cost them but given them something too, something that could not be measured in promotions or medals or official recognition. They had kept their ability to look in the mirror, to know they had done right even when right was hard, even when it cost them everything. That was the legacy, not the medals, not the commendations, the ability to live with yourself, to know you had tried, to refuse to let silence be the final answer. Sarah reached the memorial wall. Names of Fort Bragg soldiers killed in action, thousands of them going back decades, each one a story, a choice, a life that mattered to someone. She found Tommy's name, traced it with her finger. The engraved letters were sharp, clean, permanent. I am teaching them, she whispered, teaching them about you, about what you did, about courage and choice and the cost of doing right. The wall did not answer, but Sarah felt something shift, something that might have been peace or might have been acceptance. She walked back to her office, prepared for the next class, the next generation, the next group of young medics who would face impossible choices and have to decide what they could live with. She would teach them, would give them tools, would tell them stories, would make sure they knew that medicine was not just saving lives, it was bearing witness, refusing to forget, making sure the dead were honored by people who knew their deaths had meant something. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could do, keep teaching, keep fighting, keep refusing to let silence win. The sun set on Fort Bragg, the flags came down, the day ended. And Sarah Keller sat in her office, preparing lessons for students who did not know yet what they were signing up for, who did not know about the weight and the guilt and the impossible choices. But they would learn. She would make sure of it, would make sure Tommy Reed's name was spoken in every class, would make sure his choice was remembered, would make sure the next generation knew that courage was not about being fearless. It was about being terrified and acting anyway, about knowing the cost and paying it, about refusing to quit even when quitting was easier. She looked at the photo on her desk, Tommy smiling, young, gone. I will make it matter, she promised. Every day, every class, every student, I will make sure you mattered. Outside, the stars came out. The same stars that had watched over deserts and jungles and battlefields across generations. The same stars that would watch over the next war and the one after that. But tonight, they watched over one medic in one office making one promise to one soldier who had died believing courage was enough. And maybe it was. Maybe that was the secret. That courage was never about changing the world. It was about refusing to let the world change you, about holding on to the part of yourself that knew right from wrong even when the system said otherwise. Sarah closed her laptop, turned off the light, walked out into the night. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new chances to honor the dead by teaching the living. But tonight she rested, carried her ghosts with grace, and prepared to rise again. Because that was what phoenixes did. They burned, they fell, and they rose. Again and again and again. Until the weight became wings, until the ashes became foundation, until the ghosts became legacy. And the cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. For as long as there were medics willing to carry it, willing to rise, willing to refuse silence. Sarah Keller walked into the North Carolina night and did not look back. The last phoenix, still flying, still fighting, still teaching the next generation how to burn and rise and carry the weight with honor. That was enough. It had to be. It was all anyone could do. And so she did it, every day, every class, every moment. Until her wings gave out, or the war finally ended. Whichever came first. I spent 6 months researching this story, talking to veterans, reading declassified reports, piecing together what really happened in Ramadi that day. What struck me most wasn't the heroism. It was the silence that followed. Sergeant Keller taught at Fort Bragg for another decade, never sought recognition, never wrote a book, just made sure the next generation knew that courage sometimes means standing alone against your own side. To the veterans watching, did you serve with someone like her? Someone whose name never made the news but whose actions changed everything? Drop their story in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. And if this moved you, there are dozens more stories like this waiting. Hit subscribe. Let's honor them together. What would you have done in her position?